Chapter 109. If that's the case, Ling Kongzi stood up. I've given you a chance. As soon as she finished speaking, she took 2 steps back and took out the brush densely covered with talisman characters from her sleeve. Then she took out a scroll from her sleeve. As soon as the golden scroll appeared in her hand, it immediately emitted a bright light. The entire backyard was illuminated by the treasured light, and even the bean-sized raindrops that were pouring down in torrents slowed down. Every single drop of water was sparkling and translucent, reflecting the splendor of the treasured scroll. This is the Book of Luo, Ling Kongzi said slowly. It's the treasure of my Langya cave and it can write down the truth of heaven and earth. Now I use it to write just like the painting spirit of your painting sect. But it's not the same. If you haven't seen the power of the treasure of my Daotong then, just watch. She waved her hand and the golden scroll unfolded in the air. The scroll was 3 feet long, almost as long as a small table. It was empty and there was only a blank piece of paper with a misty green light on it. As soon as the Book of Luo appeared, the aura of treasure shot up to the sky, and the brilliance was bright. The entire Dragon King Temple suddenly became the brightest place in the city of Wei. When the dragon's son saw the treasure light, it roared angrily and dived down with the wind and thunder. Its real body, if laid horizontally on the ground, could stretch for 2 miles, the same length as the entire Taoshi Road. Now the full force of the giant beast's dive suddenly exploded in the air with the sound of rolling thunder. The rain and clouds were wrapped up by him, and between the layers of clouds there was a bright flash of lightning. The dragon's body immediately disappeared into the clouds, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into a tornado from the dark sky, flashing with lightning, and directly pierced into a small courtyard in the city of Wei. Li Yunxin looked up at the clouds and only felt that the whole world was pressing down. From a very far distance, it was just a slender branch that came down from the clouds. But looking from the ground, the thinnest end of this tornado was already so huge that it could envelop 7 or 8 courtyards. Behind the clouds, Long Sun's Chiwen's shimmering horns, whiskers and sharp teeth could be vaguely seen, illuminated by the lightning, making them look particularly ferocious. For the second time, Li Yunxin saw that huge eye. One eye was as tall as him. And this entire head was like a small mountain. Came crashing down. They were still 100 meters above the ground, but the wind pressure had already blown away Li Yunxin's hair bun. Even the square table in the courtyard along with the bowls and plates on it were torn to pieces. The green tiles on the roof of the entire house cracked into tiny pieces, and the house began to groan as if it couldn't bear the weight. Amidst the terrifying sounds of thunder, wind, rain and roaring, Ling Kongzi picked up the brush and wrote 3 words on the Book of Luo. Calm wind, wave. As soon as the words were formed, the entire world suddenly became quiet. Wind, rain and thunder all disappeared without a trace in an instant. It was as if a pair of invisible giant hands had replaced the stormy sky with a silent film of bright moons and glittering stars in the blink of an eye. A moment ago, there was still the deafening roar and the bone-chilling wind and rain. But now the clouds and rain had stopped, and the night sky was clear as if everything that had happened before was just an illusion. And Long Sun, who was originally roaring and diving down, suddenly lost the clouds and rain, and instantly turned back into a man in human form. He fell from 100 meters in the sky with a bang. As he fell, the soil and stones in the courtyard were scattered, and a 2-foot-deep pit was immediately formed. This pit was close to Li Yunxin and Ling Kongzi. But this Daotong cultivator was not anxious and he didn't even move half a step back. After the loud bang subsided, the 9th young master who had turned back into human form, climbed up from the ground angrily and said softly, "Give me the translucent jade scroll. Maybe you can become the guardian beast of the mountain." At this moment the sound of people could be heard. The crying of children, the screaming of women, the crowing of chickens and the barking of dogs, all of these suddenly broke out at this moment. Among the hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Wei, more than one person had seen the unusual phenomenon of the tornado wrapped with thunder and lightning. If there were brave and sharp-eyed people, they could even see the vague dragon body in the clouds. Such a strong wind and heavy rain could be considered a natural disaster. Some of the houses in the city were in ruins and they had already collapsed tonight. And the houses near the Dragon King Temple, because of Long Sun's attack just now, even the houses covered with green tiles could not withstand it, and were on the verge of collapse. So people knew, it was the Dragon King who was angry. that Shinryu had appeared. And it was in the direction of the Dragon King Temple. The people near the Dragon King Temple were running away in panic. Who cared about the appearance of the Dragon King? They had to save their lives first. And those who were trembling in fear suddenly saw the clouds and rain in the sky suddenly stopped, as if it was a nightmare, and they were surprised. In this life, who could see Shinryu? Since the clouds and rain had stopped, why not hurry to the Dragon King Temple and see if there would be a dragon scale or beard left by the Dragon King? At least they could get some dragon energy. So people gradually gathered their courage and walked towards the Dragon King Temple. At first there were only a few, and then there were groups of 3 to 5. After a quarter of an hour, there were already people gathering. It was said that the divine dragon had appeared in the Dragon King Temple, and was going to pick up the beard and dragon scale. Such noise very quickly came from all directions. At this time the dragon's son, who was no longer in the wind and rain, was already standing in the courtyard. He glared at Ling Kongzi, and his eyes turned from black to light yellow, and his thin pupils indicated that he was in a state of extreme rage. He opened his mouth angrily and revealed 2 rows of extremely sharp teeth. Do you know that I am Qi Wen? My father is the ruler of all the demons in the world, the only divine dragon in the world. You are courting death. After saying this, he waved his sleeve and was about to rise from the clouds and rise to the sky. But this time, Li Yunxin saw some faint dragon scales suddenly appear under his white robe, but soon disappeared like a phantom. A few clouds of water vapor appeared around the 9th young master, but disappeared in a flash like the white fog of winter. This time he didn't fly away from the clouds. His feet were still firmly on the ground. But Ling Kongzi stretched out his hand and gently combed a strand of hair beside his ear, and looked at Dragon's son. The storm has been settled. Where do you want to go? You are born with the body of a great demon, and ordinary people can't do anything to you. Even if I am at the peak of the transcendent state, I can only injure you. But today I brought this magic treasure and also set up a magic array. I have cut off your fate with this world, and your mana is isolated outside the city walls of Wei, and you can't use it. Can you feel it? If it wasn't for the fear of endangering the lives of all the people in the city, I could have turned you into a rain of blood when you were in the sky, and you would not be noisy here. Give me the jade scroll. Maybe you can become the guardian beast. Hearing these words from Ling Kongzi, the originally angry 9th young master suddenly laughed sinisterly. He didn't try to fly but put his hands behind his back and stared at the scroll in front of Ling Kongzi. Ah? Magic treasure? What magic treasure? Li Yunxin recognized this look. That night when he took the translucent jade scroll from him, he had the same look. Chapter 110. The great demon didn't seem to take Ling Kongzi's words seriously. Ling Kongzi shook her head gently. Stubborn. She knew that demons were different from ordinary people. Even if they looked like humans and were more agile than humans, it was hard to get rid of their beastly nature. For instance, a cat is staring intently at something, and if you make a noise somewhere else or put a little thing that will attract its attention, it will immediately turn and run away, forgetting all about it. A great demon like 9th young master felt that he was strong but also had a wild nature. Ling Kongzi just took it as his bestial nature acting up and could not be bothered with him. Instead she turned to Li Yunxin. Did you see that? This is the power of Daotong's magic weapon. In this city fate will be cut off. His life and death are in my hands. You are a good painter, a Taoist painter who can make treasured scrolls. That's why I tolerated you doing so many things in the city. When you were in Qianghua House you said it very well. You are very useful. The things you said to me before, such as sacrificing yourself for him, I didn't believe it. Now I'm telling you these things. If you still have other thoughts such as continuing to live and cultivate, then don't do stupid things. Here I'm giving you a chance to live. The first chance I gave you was in Qiao's house. The second chance I gave you was in Qianghua House. Now this is the third chance I'm giving you. I have a good impression of you and I don't want you to end up with your body and soul destroyed. So I watched you do those things and tolerated you until now. It's to let you see what I, Daotong, can do and how powerless your schemes are in front of such power. But Li Yunxin just sat there with his hair down with the sword on his knees. Because he lost too much blood from the wound on his little finger, his lips were a little pale. He opened his eyes and slightly raised his head to look at Lu Ling. His long eyelashes were trembling and his whole body was trembling. After looking at her for a while he said with difficulty, Believe it or not, it's up to you. Lu Ling looked at him for a while before letting out a low sigh. There's one more thing. Dino, I sent someone to tell Yin Pingji, Taoist Lu, this is your Taoist heart. Naturally, he doesn't know what a Taoist heart is, but he knows that it's a person who can make you wish you were dead if you're killed. It doesn't matter what method you use, whether it's a real death or a fake death. The day you die, Yin Pingji will come and get rid of him. If you really want to die, then I'm just being paranoid and want him to accompany you. If you are indeed plotting, are you willing to lose your Tao heart or this tribulation? Li Yunxin closed his eyes and thought for a while before opening them again. Used to be a little white flower, how did you become a scheming bitch? Is it because I told you in Qianghua Tower that he might be my Tao heart or Tao tribulation, that you're thinking about him? But, you always say that Tao Tong is awesome. There are countless ways to mess with me, so why bother making things difficult for him? Actually, what else do you want to do? Lu Ling seemed to smile slightly. You're a smart person after all. You're not the only one who can use a scheme to kill two birds with one stone. That magistrate has cruelly harmed the common people, but I can't use this to deal with him. But if his subordinates kill cultivators, this Taoist Lu, you should have taught him the Heavens Will technique. Then it's Dao Tong's business. I'm doing it for him but also for more things. It's just that you ran into it. Li Yunxin sighed. I understand. That person bending the law for personal gain is just an excuse. You or someone behind you is plotting more things. You'll have to deal with him eventually. But you've said so much, is that all you want to say? I always feel that you're stalling for time. Ling Kongzi laughed softly. Indeed. Severing fate fruit and killing living souls are both against the harmony of heaven. Since it's against the harmony of heaven, let heaven do it. It's better for humans not to interfere. It's now the hour of the Su, the time when the righteous cultivators of heaven and earth patrol the human world. It's the most suitable time to kill this demon. She finally turned to the 9th young master. Since you're not willing to hand over the jade slip, I'll deal with you and take my time to find it. As soon as she finished speaking, she heard the sound of the wall collapsing. The courtyard wall of the Dragon King Temple was already on the verge of collapsing when the 9th young master's real body swooped down from the sky. At this time, after being soaked in water for a long time, it finally couldn't support itself and collapsed. Because it was the night after the rain, there wasn't too much smoke and dust. Although only a long strip of the west wall beside the door collapsed, but the crowd outside the wall could already be seen. In the courtyard, the brilliance of the ancient book suddenly poured out, covering a large part of the street. In such an era, at such a time, to see such brilliance and to see the person standing in front of the scroll, the people who came to the Dragon King Temple to watch the fun were stunned for a moment, and then they exclaimed in a low voice like a breeze, the immortal had appeared. Some recognized that Li Yunxin was the one who walked around the city recently, and created such a miraculous scene in the Willow River, so they thought that the strange scene tonight was most likely caused by this immortal. But there were also some clever ones who felt that the atmosphere there did not seem to be right. It did not look like the immortals were praising the breeze and the bright moon, but more like the immortals were fighting, so they were wavering between staying far away and taking a good look at this rare spectacle. Until they saw the female immortal with a blurry face raise her left hand to the top of her head. Like pulling out a transparent hairpin, she pulled something out. Then a green light flashed on Ling Kongzi's body. At this moment she actually completely changed her appearance. It was a plain white dress with a simple Taoist bun. But at this moment she finally revealed her true appearance. It was a pink palace dress with big sleeves, a gorgeous cloud bun decorated with jewels and gold jewelry, a pendant decorated all over her body, and a face that was incomparably beautiful like that of a goddess. When they saw this kind of attire that could only appear in paintings and this kind of appearance that was difficult to imagine unless they saw it with their own eyes, the ordinary people outside the courtyard instantly became deathly silent. However, in the next moment, they knelt on the ground in unison and started shouting and praising in a disorderly manner. But Ling Kongzi didn't care about those ordinary people. She just slightly turned her face to look at Li Yunxin. However, the latter didn't seem to have much special feelings about her true appearance. He just slightly raised his eyebrows. She looked solemnly at the dragon's son who had been imprisoned in the pit. Your time has come. Then she shook her left hand gently, and an invisible shadow stood on the ground. In a breath's time, this shadow slowly became clear. It was actually the appearance of the plain and unclear Ling Kongzi from before. At this time Li Yunxin, who had been looking at her coldly, finally asked, "What kind of treasure is this?" A subtle and strange feeling of satisfaction flashed through her heart. Lu Ling hesitated for a moment, but still raised her head slightly, coldly looked at Li Yunxin and said, "This is a feather robe. When worn on the body, in addition to repelling external evil and hiding one's appearance, it can also absorb people's essence, qi, and spiritual power. When the time is right, take it off and temporarily give birth to another you. Although it can't last long, but during this period of time you can do many things. For example, bear this fruit of fate that goes against the harmony of heaven." Then she lightly waved her hand and said in a low voice, "Go." After saying this in a low voice, Ling Kongzi, who was dressed in splendid palace robes, suddenly took a step back, giving up the position of the Book of Luo. And the doppelganger, Lu Ling, stepped forward and grabbed the talisman brush suspended in mid-air. The brush moved like dragons and snakes, and in one breath he wrote 3 words, "Golden Wrong Blade." Once the words were written, the treasure scroll immediately emitted a green light. In the pit around the 9th young master, 4 golden-armored strong men suddenly appeared out of thin air. These 4 strong men occupied the front, back, left and right of the 9th young master, and each of them held a cold saw wrapped in gold. Their eyes shone brightly and they chanted in unison, "The 4 directions night-wandering gods are here. Under the order of the celestial master, slaying evil." Their voices were like a great bell reverberating for several miles, scaring the surrounding commoners into kowtowing like pounding garlic. Even their voices could not be heard. As soon as the 4 strong men's voices fell, the 4 cold saws chopped down towards Long Sun's head. This was imposing momentum, unparalleled killing intent, gods and ghosts flee, and turbulent wind and clouds. With a loud noise, a cloud of dust suddenly rose from the pit and soared into the sky. The flying debris hit the broken walls and bamboo, making a cracking sound. It made people wonder if there was a demon's flesh and blood mixed in it. As for Ling Kongzi, after taking a step back, she only stared at Li Yunxin, who was kneeling on the ground without a moment's distraction. After the 4 strong men killed with all their might, and the cloud of dust rose, she said in a cold voice, "Are you sure you don't want to think about it? Now you have seen it. If I, Daotong, kill this dragon son with my magic weapon, it will be like a little girl. Does she really think that with this thing she can do anything to me?" However, her words were suddenly interrupted by such a sentence that was filled with killing intent, anger and coldness. Ling Kongzi turned around right away and took 2 steps back successively before withdrawing a bright and golden brass small mirror from his sleeve. After that he looked at the pit where the dust and mist had already dispersed. 2 pairs of jet-black antlers had already sprouted from Long Zixi's forehead. His clothes were torn and tattered, revealing a body of steel-like scales underneath. His hair had turned white like the hair on his real body. On both sides of his cheeks, there were tattoos and small scales. He opened his big mouth, which was full of shining sharp teeth, and let out a roar that sounded like billions of male beasts roaring at the moon. "I am Wei River Dragon King." Chapter 111. Before this furious roar, which pierced through the clouds and shook the 9 heavens, could stop, 9th young master's body swayed and he grew in the wind. What a good dragon son. In just one breath he became a demon with a height of more than 10 feet, eyes as big as copper bells, and a mouth as big as a blood basin. This fiend celestial, who was twice as tall as Lu Ling, had bulging muscles and was covered in dark green scales that were as sharp as blades. Although his eyebrows were long and slender, and when he closed his mouth, there was a pair of huge coral antlers on his forehead. The dragon antlers were bright red, as if every branch was smeared with human blood and would flow down the next moment. The hair on his head was snow white, which made the pair of antlers even more dazzling. As soon as the dragon's son showed his demon body, the mortals outside the temple were shocked. People talked about immortals, ghosts and demons. But how many of them had actually seen a demon? Not even 1 in a million beasts possess spiritual intelligence. Even if they do possess spiritual intelligence, those who commit evil acts in the human world but have low cultivation base have long been eliminated. Those with higher cultivation would have understood the ways of the world. They would either play some tricks and pretend to be a living god to collect incense, or they would still do evil but not be too arrogant. Even a big demon like the ninth young master, although he ate humans openly, would not appear in the city during the day. If he really angered the Daotong Kenzo, he would not be able to get away with it. After all, humanity was flourishing in this world. Even a big demon who knew everything in the world could not go against the law of nature. But at this moment, the dragon's son showed his human Dharmakaya in front of the people of the city of Wei. As soon as he appeared, the surrounding area was filled with green light and misty water vapor. He really looked like a demon that had leaped out of hell. Yan Wei scared the people outside the temple so much that their legs turned to jelly. They didn't even have the strength to run for their lives. They could only kowtow like pounding garlic, begging for help. This dragon Z let out a laughter that was as loud as a bell. Using his golden eyes to stare at Ling Kongzi viciously, he tilted his head slightly and looked down at her. You stupid Taoist. Broken fate fruit? There are millions and millions of demons in the world. You can go and break anyone's karma. But you have to break my karma. Didn't anyone teach you that I, the dragons, do not belong to the 3 realms and 5 elements? This king has no fate in this world to begin with. At this point he suddenly frowned. Moisey. With a wave of his hand, a wave of divine power grabbed a crying child from the crowd, and the child landed in his palm. Before Ling Kongzi could react, the demon clenched his fist and raised his head. He swallowed the child's blood that flowed out from between his fingers. He clenched his fist a few more times. When he could not squeeze any more blood out, he threw away a pile of flesh and bones that could no longer be seen. The moment the child's screams came to an abrupt end, the crowd near the Dragon King temple also fell silent. The 9th young master looked at them with his demonic eyes and said, "If you keep talking, don't annoy me. I'll eat them all." No one dared to make a sound after the thunderous roar. Even if there were some ignorant children crying, their mouths would be tightly covered. Some of them recovered from the fright and found a gap in the crowd to sneak out. On the other hand, even more commoners that didn't have much knowledge and were cowardly were like lambs that were terrified to the point of being slaughtered, and they lay on the ground while shivering while using their gazes to look at the peerlessly gorgeous Ling Kongzi. The 9th young master looked at Ling Kongzi and smiled cruelly. You stupid Taoist. You can't even protect yourself and you want to stand up for them? However, Ling Kongzi had already calmed down with the bronze mirror in her hand. She pulled out a white jade hairpin with phoenix wings inlaid with gold from the hairpins on her head. She snorted, I don't have the mood to stand up for these mortals. But you can't protect yourself? You really don't know the power of my Taoist magic weapon. Then she hit the bronze mirror with the white jade hairpin. The sound of metal and stone colliding could be heard. It was like celestial music from the 9 heavens. The lingering sound lingered in everyone's ears. Ling Kongzi, who was originally standing in front of the Book of Luo, suddenly became like a marionette, and his 4 limbs suddenly trembled. Ling Kongzi hit the mirror a second time. An illusory figure suddenly separated from the puppet, and began to dance with joy. She quickly hit the mirror 4 times. Then 5 clones appeared in front of the scroll. As soon as the 5 avatars appeared, they joined hands and started writing on the scroll. The Book of Luo shone brightly again. It even forced back the fierce aura of the 9th young master's avatar. Ling Kongzi's footsteps moved once more, and he wrote 6 talisman markings in the sky. Suddenly, the front of the Book of Luo shone brightly again. She seemed to have set up several strong restrictions to prevent Long Sun from rushing to the front of the scroll. But in the next moment, Long Sun rushed to the front of the Book of Luo. His huge, towering body moved, stirring up a whirlwind on the ground. The golden restrictions that Ling Kongzi had just set up shattered into pieces like paper, and they only left behind numerous glowing halos in the sky. No matter what kind of restriction it was, it couldn't hurt Long Sun at all. It couldn't stop him at all. He strode over to arrive before the treasure scroll with 3 steps before grabbing out with his hand, and he grabbed the treasure scroll along with Ling Kongzi's feather-clothed clone in his palm. He used some kind of magical power. When he opened it again, it was gone. The dragon's son laughed out loud, causing the gravel on the ground to tremble slightly. Stupid Taoist. You know that I like shiny treasures, so you came to give me a treasure. If you were hiding in the city, you might be able to harm me with your Taoist techniques. But now you've sent yourself to me. I don't have any fate. Why would I be afraid of your techniques? Stupid Taoist, how do you think I'm able to dominate the world? The ninth young master leaned forward and stared at Lu Ling. He raised his voice. You deserve to die. As soon as he finished speaking, the fiend god had already moved forward ferociously, and his fist smashed towards Ling Kongzi. Like a mountain crashing down, this punch tore through the air, stirring up ripples that swept away a large area of water on the ground in an instant. Ling Kongzi could only dodge when facing a strike like this. She shouted in a low voice. The ornaments on her body emitted a dazzling light. They supported her and moved her a step to the side. Long Sun punched the ground. With a loud bang, the wall on the other side that hadn't collapsed also came crashing down. The raging wind, the arrow-like water currents, and the scattered debris. All of them bombarded Li Yunxin's body, almost knocking him down. When he once again strenuously propped himself up, Long Zi and Ling Kongzi were already fighting each other. Although cultivators tempered their bodies, they weren't as strong as demons in the end. It was originally impossible for this Ling Kongzi to be evenly matched with this dragon. But she had a lot of magic treasures on her. Magic treasures were called magic treasures because they were rare and precious. But Li Yunxin realized that Ling Kongzi seemed to be. Every piece of clothing and ornament was a magic treasure. No wonder. She wore the feather clothes to cover her face. But she only fought with the demon in the Dragon King temple. She dodged left and right, but she couldn't get out of this place. Li Yunxin realized that she was plotting something. But he didn't care. Right now he was right amidst the strong gales that the two of them were exchanging blows with each other. Ling Kongzi was fighting Long Zi with a thin sword, and no matter if it was the wind from the sword or the wind from the fist, so long as a little bit of it touched him, his body would be destroyed. So he stood up with difficulty. Carrying the sword, he walked along the wall, to the front of the crowd. When the people who were originally trembling in fear saw him coming, they hurriedly said, Immortal Master above, Immortal Master above, those two are fighting. What should we do? Li Yunxin found a collapsed rock and sat down. He rolled his eyes at the person who asked, Are you stupid? That's Dragon King? The person who asked was trembling. He only dared to look at the two people. Alas, I don't know who the demon is. But if we run when we see immortals fighting demons, when the immortals blame us. Li Yunxin listened to him. He was stunned for a moment and then sighed. Oh, yes. After all, you are, well, ignorant and superstitious ancient working people. Usually you don't have any serious beliefs. But when you see the immortals, you are more afraid of karma than anyone else. He waved his hand weakly. I'll forgive you. Run for your lives. But the few of you go to that house. There's a Lao Dao inside. Carry him out and take him with you. As soon as he said this, the people outside turned and ran as if they had been granted amnesty. The people who were pointed at by him looked hesitant. They looked into the house and knelt down saying, Immortal, please don't make things difficult for us. They are fighting fiercely there. If we go into the house it might collapse. Li Yunxin was already irritated by the pain. Hearing this, he glared and raised his eyebrows. He lifted his leg and kicked the person in front. I'm talking to you nicely. Why the F***ck do you want to take advantage of me? Then he waved his sword and cut the big green rock beside him into two as if he was cutting tofu. Do I look like a F***king good person to you? Go right now. If anything happens to that Lao Dao inside, I'll kill your whole family. As soon as he shouted, the people immediately got up from the ground. They covered their heads and ran toward the house with trembling legs. Not long after, Lu Lao Dao was carried out from the house. He looked at Li Yunxin from afar and didn't dare to come closer. Long Sun and Ling Kongzi were fighting on the other side of the courtyard. One was fierce and domineering while the other was light and agile. The thin sword stabbed on Long Sun's scales, creating sparks and clanking sounds. But this thin sword was unable to break through the layer of Ling Kongzi's armor. Instead, it caused this great demon who had failed to hit Ling Kongzi time and time again to roar in anger. A few people carried old Taoist Lu, who was trembling like a spring that had been bounced a few times in the strong wind. Li Yunxin sighed and waved his hand at them. Thus these people carried old Taoist Lu and ran away like a wisp of smoke. Then he sat down again and stared at the fairy and Long Sun. Ling Kongzi had just set up a tactical array in this courtyard. So he didn't go out and just waited for the right time. As for the ninth young master, Li Yunxin felt that he didn't have long to live. If he was really going to win according to his character, he wouldn't be so angry and impatient. He made himself more comfortable, averted his eyes and looked into the distance. The city of Wei was lit up. The news had spread. Almost no one could sleep peacefully tonight. The people would be as lively as during the day. So far, although there were some twists and turns, everything was going according to plan. Li Yunxin thought for a while, then picked up the sword and raised his left hand. With a little force, he cut off his ring finger. Then he gritted his teeth and took a deep breath. He stared at the broken finger and the bright red blood on the ground, but his face showed a twisted smile. I'm really AF** King Genius. The battle didn't last long as Li Yunxin had expected. If the Dharmakaya of the 9th young master could change at will, why did he have to look like a young master in white? When the 9th young master made his move, it was on a completely different level from the 9th young master's move. After a quarter of an hour, the earth-shattering roar gradually weakened. The two fought for a few rounds. The backyard of the Dragon King Temple had been razed to the ground. Even the front yard had collapsed into a pile of rubble. When the smoke slowly dispersed, the things that Ling Kongzi had set up in the Dragon King Temple could finally be seen. Li Yunxin thought that the small courtyard of the Dragon King Temple was the square inch of heaven and earth. How he really saw it. 12 slender golden rays with the small courtyard of the Dragon King Temple as the base, outlined a cube in the air. Just now Ling Kongzi dodged left and right. He only used the thin sword in his hand to block Dragon Sun's attack. He never jumped out of the cube. At this moment, that Longzi actually seemed to be faintly exhausted. He still looked majestic, but he was half kneeling on the ground. His chest was heaving up and down like a bellow. He propped himself up with 2 arms and stared at the female Taoist with a pair of golden eyes. The thin sword in Ling Kongzi's hand was broken. She stood high on the only thin bamboo that had not been broken by the strong wind. She looked at the broken sword and threw it at Dragon Sun. Dragon Sun did not dodge. He let the short sword spin and slash his face. 3 thin scales were struck off. Ah, Li Yunxin said softly. It turned out that his Dharmakaya was not innately strong and could break all prohibitions. Without magic power, it would still be weak. He noted this point down as well. This treasure is called core. Ling Kongzi spoke in a calm and composed manner, and he combed the hair on his temples. The night wind blew her hair to the side of her mouth, making her look beautiful. If you use a little bit of strength in the square inch, it will drain you twice as much strength. If an ordinary person entered this place, he would probably collapse after a few steps. If a perfected master entered this place and attacked with all his strength, he could only last for a quarter of an hour. You actually managed to hold on for so long. You are a natural demon after all. Now that your Dharmakaya is broken, hand over the Book of Luo, the feather robe and the bright jade room and I will. She paused for a moment. It seemed that she had used up too much energy and her brain was not as agile. She wanted to kill him, so what else could she do? Ling Kongzi's face darkened. After a moment of silence she said, Fine. You're a demon. You won't change. I'll get rid of you first, then I'll look for more. After saying this, she turned her head slightly to look at Li Yunxin. The 9th young master also turned his head and stared at him. Since the first time they met, this demon had never been so embarrassed. He stared at Li Yunxin with a pair of golden eyes, gritted his teeth and breathed out white mist from his nostrils. He just stared at him. Li Yunxin could only sigh when he was stared at by 2 people at the same time. He spread his hands and tilted his head. What do you think? The pupils of the white-haired ferocious beast became even thinner in the night. He suddenly turned his head to look at Ling Kongzi, then at Li Yunxin. Finally, he exerted strength in his arms and stood up shakily. You lied to me. Li Yunxin shrugged. Yes. Longzi's eyes suddenly widened and he took a step forward as if he was about to collapse. He had to stop. More steam came out of his nostrils and mouth. Why? Li Yunxin was silent for a while and slightly frowned. Why? It's very embarrassing. Friend, why do you ask? You always hit me. You hit me twice. And you always want to eat me. You make me feel uncomfortable. You also took the translucent jade scroll. You know, I really like that thing. And you also ate Inshuero. If you did one less thing, I would think about whether I should really kill you or not. Li Yunxin looked straight into Long Sun's eyes. I hate people who kill girls the most. Girls are such adorable creatures. The ninth young master glared at Li Yunxin with a pair of glistening yellow eyes. His body was covered with dark green scales. He stared at Li Yunxin for a while before he suddenly shouted furiously, "What translucent jade slip? Are you talking about that little thing? I only wanted to take something from you, so I gave you an armor. That armor is this young master's. Rebel. My scale. My reverse scale. That woman. If you say so, I won't eat her. I also didn't eat that Lao Dao." After saying all this, the dragon stared at Li Yunxin for a long time, and then roared again, "Aren't we friends? You said so." Li Yunxin just sat on the rock and didn't say anything, but his eyes slowly looked down. He heard the sound of the night wind passing through the only thin bamboo in the courtyard. Long Sun's breathing became heavier, but the mist coming out of his mouth and nose became less and less. The scales on his body became sparse and his body became smaller. The two horns on his head began to fade and shrink. He stared at Li Yunxin and finally turned into the handsome ninth young master. But at this moment he was naked and his hair was messy. He was so weak that he looked like an ordinary human. Li Yunxin was silent for a while and then smiled. "I see. I'm sorry. I didn't live up to your kindness. But most of the time, you don't think the other party should accept what you've given. Maybe what you give isn't what the other party wants. When it comes to relationships, it has to be consensual." "I'm sorry, ninth young master." Li Yunxin raised his eyes again and looked at him. Hee, you're lucky enough to die and time travel again. Of course you don't know what time travel is, but it's not important. If you meet me again, then remember, don't believe a single word I said. You can eat me that night." After saying that, Li Yunxin forced himself to stand up. His condition was actually not much better than this extremely weak dragon son, but in the end he was still slightly better. He carried the sword and walked slowly to stand in front of Dragon Son. He looked into his eyes and sighed, "My friend, since so many misunderstandings have led us to this stage, just let me see you off. I don't think you'll be happy to die in the hands of that woman." Dragon Son still didn't say anything. He just nodded slightly. So Li Yunxin raised the small sword with difficulty. With a light stab, the whole sword went into Dragon Son's chest. Soon after, he pulled downwards again. This sword nearly split Long Zi's body into two halves. Fresh blood and internal organs flowed out with a splash. But because of this action, Li Yunxin's body leaned forward slightly. So the dying Dragon Son took the opportunity to jump into his arms. The nails on his right hand suddenly grew and pierced deep into his body. This Dragon Son used the last of his strength to widen his eyes and roared in Li Yunxin's ear, "I am Wei River Dragon King." These words took away the last of his life force. After that, his body suddenly became blurry. Gradually it became transparent. Then this transparent body began to tremble. In the end, it turned into a flowing green light. Losing her support, Li Yunxin knelt on the ground with a thud. 5 terrible holes appeared on his back. It had pierced through his body. If it wasn't for the strong physique of a cultivator, he would have died. But blood kept flowing out. In just a short while his body was completely dyed red. The loss of blood brought about a strong dizziness and an irresistible sleepiness. In such tiredness, he leaned on the sword and stared at the place where the 9th young master's body disappeared. He was silent for a while. "He doesn't seem to be as bad as you think." Ling Kongzi floated down from the bamboo and looked worriedly at the wound on Li Yunxin's back. "But an animal is an animal. Even if I die, I want you to be buried with me." Li Yunxin coughed up a few mouthfuls of blood. He tried a few times before he could speak. "Your words don't make sense. At least when I saw him, I knew he was a dangerous guy. Some people look kind but are actually very scary." Ling Kongzi took a step back and looked at Li Yunxin with a frown. "What do you mean?" Li Yunxin raised his head and smiled weakly. "Are you afraid of me?" The gorgeous priestess looked at him for a while and shook her head slightly. "Logically you shouldn't be alive. But you..." She subconsciously looked at the place where the 9th young master's body disappeared. "You are indeed scary. But his corpse, what was going on? Even his soul dissipated along with it?" Li Yunxin raised his head and looked into the distance. He quickly looked away and handed the thin sword in his hand to Ling Kongzi. "If you are afraid of me, then kill me." Ling Kongzi was still frowning. He even took a step back and didn't take it. because she realized that from a certain point of view, it was Li Yunxin's plan to get her to help him kill Dragon Sun. She was at the peak of transcendent state and Dragon Sun was a rare and powerful monster. But it seemed that they were both used by him. You are afraid, beauty. Li Yunxin looked at her. The problem is that I am already like this. What are you afraid of? Ling Kongzi was still looking at him. Therefore Li Yunxin sighed and tried to stab the sword in her hand into her chest. But he managed to stand up. But he couldn't stab it anymore. He could only look at Ling Kongzi for help. He spat out a few mouthfuls of blood and said, "It really hurts, my friend." After watching for a while, when he finally couldn't stand it anymore and was about to close his eyes, Ling Kongzi sighed heavily. He stepped forward and pressed his palm on the hilt of the sword. The snow-white sword pierced into Li Yunxin's chest without any resistance. He breathed out his last breath and closed his eyes as if he was relieved. Ling Kongzi brushed his left hand over his eyes, and he saw a soul standing up from his corpse in a daze. Without any hesitation he used the small mirror in his sleeve to strike the soul. There was a deep sigh that sounded like a gentle breeze. Li Yunxin's soul disappeared without a trace. Ling Kongzi held the small sword and stood there for a while. Then he said in a low voice, "That's it?" But then he heard the sound of a copper bell. In the night and the night wind, there was only one sound. It appeared out of nowhere. She held the sword warily and turned to look at the street outside the courtyard. A young girl with her hair tied loosely behind her head was riding a black donkey. She was staring at the sword in her hand. And Li Yunxin's body. Chapter 112. The dust caused by the fight with Long Sun had dissipated, and the air was filled with the sweet smell of Li Yunxin's blood. There was a slight earthy smell in the ruins of the collapsed walls, but the crushed flowers and trees in the courtyard still had a strong fragrance. At such a night, at such a moment, Ling Kongzi exhaled slightly, and adjusted her body into a battle-ready state again in an unnoticeable manner. Her heartstrings were tight and she was on the alert. Especially when she was facing the 9th young master and Li Yunxin. When did this woman appear? She had many magic treasures on her, so it was not difficult for her to face a great demon like the 9th young master. But the woman in front of her, she could not see through her. Because no matter how she looked and felt, she was just an ordinary person. Therefore she subconsciously clenched the thin white sword in her hand, which had killed the 9th young master and Li Yunxin, and asked, "Who are you, young lady?" From afar came the sound of dogs barking in human voices. One of the brave ones saw that both of them were dead in the vicinity, and went to report the news. After all, the city of Wei was under the rule of the emperor. Mortals could not do anything when immortals fought. But this matter was over, and it would be unreasonable if the government did not intervene. But the woman on the black donkey only stared at the sword in her hand. After staring for a while, she got off the donkey. Her figure was similar to Ling Kongzi, and even though she wore plain clothes like a daughter from a humble family, she could still be considered to be an extremely outstanding beauty. Compared to Ling Kongzi's beauty, she had a different kind of charm. She did not answer. After standing still, she moved her eyes from the sword to Ling Kongzi's face. Then she raised her hand and waved. Ling Kongzi suspected that she was going to attack and subconsciously raised her sword to block. But the sword in her hand suddenly flew out of her hand and into the woman's hand. She was a peak stage transcendent state overlord, and her physical strength was beyond the imagination of mortals. Although the hands holding the sword looked slender and tender, these fingers were filled with spiritual power. Two of them could easily crush the bones of a strong man's arm. But now the sword had easily escaped from her hand because the sword turned into a feather. When it landed in the woman's hand, it had already turned into a long, pure white feather. At this time, Ling Kongzi realized that the shape of the rapier really did look like a slender feather. She gently stroked the feather and put it into her sleeve. Then he suddenly smiled and said, "Me? My name is Bai Yunxin. I'm Li Yunxin's good friend. He's mine. Did you also use this feather to kill Dragon Little 9? He's mine too." Bai Yunxin raised her head slightly as she stared at Ling Kongzi with her big and round eyes, and she asked her like a real little girl who was 17 or 18 years old, "Tell me, why did you kill them?" At this moment, Ling Kongzi was convinced that this was a monster. A big monster. A monster that was far more powerful than the 9th dragon son. This kind of strange evil aura, was faintly revealed from her hair, clothes, and every word she said. Humans did not have such an aura. She quickly weighed the pros and cons of running away and said slowly, "The ninth dragon's son robbed Daotong's Dharma treasures and refused to return them. Li Yunxin killed himself. Daotong, the treasures of the Langya Grotto heaven, the ancient book and the feather robe. And the treasures of the two saints, the jade scroll of enlightenment." When she said this, she was interrupted by Yunxin's laughter. He seemed to have heard something very interesting. She covered her mouth and chuckled. Although her voice was soft, it was strangely clear, as if it could reach the ninth heaven through the ruins of the Dragon King's temple. At this time, the bailiffs of the government finally rushed over, only to see two beautiful women talking. The official leading the team watched carefully for a while and realized that things did not seem to end as they thought. Because the girl who was laughing with her hands covering her mouth, although she was laughing and making a sound, her eyes were still wide open. They didn't bend or narrow like ordinary people. It was as if her eyes couldn't bend. It looked very strange. She stared for a while, then put down her hand and her expression suddenly became cold. The feather robe? Her tone was cold, as if she was full of anger. Daotong's Dharma treasure? Bolsh *. But after saying this, she quickly covered her mouth again. "You can't talk like this. All heard it, right?" This sentence was directed at the officials. She twisted the corner of her clothes with her other hand, like a girl who had done something wrong and was afraid of being found out. Even the slowest person could realize that the situation was unusual. The official leading the team subconsciously pressed the short knife at his waist and took a step back. You must have heard it." Bai Yunxin frowned. "Trouble." As soon as she finished speaking, she casually swung her arm. A large feather-like shadow appeared along with her arm and quickly expanded. Before the official could finish his words, he stopped talking. After a breath, the upper bodies of him and the 20 or 30 people behind him all slid down, revealing a very smooth and clean cut. Before the broken bodies fell to the ground, the row of houses behind them began to collapse with a rumble, and a large amount of smoke rose. The rumbling sound of the house collapsing could be heard for a few miles. When the smoke finally dispersed, Ling Kongzi realized, Bai Yunxin's casual attack just now destroyed half of the Taoshi Road. This was definitely not, a top predator among the demons that she, who was at the peak of the transcendent state, could deal with. Even if she gave up all her magic weapons, she might not be able to escape unscathed. Bai Yunxin stared at Ling Kongzi again and showed her small white teeth. "Give me the feather clothes. Give me the ninth one. Give me the soul food." As soon as the high-pitched voice came out, Lu Ling did not hesitate at all. She rushed to the sky and flew straight to the north. The magic weapons on her all shone, and like a colorful shooting star, she flew hundreds of meters away in the blink of an eye. But the next moment, everyone in the city of Wei heard a series of loud rumbling sounds, which made the doors and windows of the city tremble. A conical cloud of white mist suddenly erupted in the night sky, followed by a second cloud, a third cloud, and a fourth cloud. A series of sonic booms formed from surpassing the speed of sound appeared in the sky above the city of Wei almost at the same instant, chasing after Ling Kongzi's figure. In the end, a large expanse of golden light suddenly burst out from the body of the cultivator with brilliant and colorful flowing lights. Like a bird with broken wings, he fell diagonally into the forest outside the city of Wei. This night, at this moment, almost everyone heard a sharp, high-pitched, ear-piercing cry of a crane at the same time, and an illusion of a white crane with wings that could almost cover the whole city of Wei flashed and disappeared in the sky. And the little black donkey was left in the same place. After waiting for a while, it did not see its master, so it trotted along the road, avoiding the ruins, and slowly walked in the direction of its master. After a few steps, it suddenly stopped, sneezed, and shook its ears in confusion. Because the whole city of Wei suddenly quieted down. After the battle between Bai Yunxin and Ling Kongzi, the whole city, which was inhabited by hundreds of thousands of people, suddenly quieted down. They felt sleepy at the same time, and at the same time, in such a night that they could not sleep peacefully, they fell asleep. The yang qi of hundreds of thousands of people began to circulate. Chapter 113. In such silence, a faint light appeared in a family's house in the West River Prefecture of the city of Wei. This was a rich family. vermilion door, stone lions and a three-way courtyard. The light appeared in the study of the family's master. 3 days ago, Li Yunxin had paid a visit to this house, and the gatekeeper had informed her of her arrival. The family's master was brave, so he welcomed him in, treated him with good food and drinks and asked for some calligraphy. Coincidentally, the family's master had a son, so Li Yunxin made a painting called The Immortal Old Man Sending His Son. It was not a precious scroll nor a rare scroll but a famous one. But for this kind of family, a scroll made by Li Yunxin was a treasure that could be passed down from generation to generation. The master asked an old master to frame the painting and hang it in the study. He planned to admire it for half a month, and when it was completely dry he would put it in a yellow silk bag, and when there were guests coming to the family he would ask it to come out and admire it. But tonight there was a storm and the news of the fairy fighting the Dragon King came. They were doubtful, but soon they heard the roar and the strange phenomenon in the sky. These things were natural disasters for the ordinary people. So the whole family gathered together in this study, thinking that the famous scroll of the master might be able to bless them with their safety. But just as the ball of flowing light fell out of the city of Wei, the sudden drowsiness quickly attacked the family. The master felt something was wrong and tried to grab the sword hanging on the wall with the last bit of consciousness in his heart. But he still fell asleep. So, the painting of the immortal old man sending his son on the wall glowed with a misty golden light. After the light flashed, the baby on the painting came to life. The baby made of golden light jumped out of the painting and stepped on the bodies of the people who were sleeping on the ground. It first went to the mouth and nose of the master, who had the most yang energy, and took a deep breath. Then it went to the mouth and nose of the housewife and took another breath. So it breathed in the human energy of the people in the house and jumped out of the door. Through the wall, it breathed in the human energy of the servants in the house. Then he walked out of the door. The golden child seemed to love the smell of humans the most. He continued to search for the people sleeping in the silent houses. After an hour, when it had walked further and further away, it would see its own kind. There were strong men who walked out of the Shin Tu Bei Jian painting, and there were youths who walked out of the Su Qin chiseling light painting. They were all paintings that Li Yunxin had made for the rich families in the first 2 days. There were babies, children, young adults, and middle-aged men floating around the city and sucking in people's energy. Some were happy, some were sad, some were angry, and some were calm. In the past 2 days, Li Yunxin had made a total of 46 paintings. The people in these 46 paintings had walked out of the paintings one after another. They were all doing one thing: absorbing yang energy. Those who had been sucked out would probably not feel anything when they woke up. At most, some of the weaker ones would feel a little tired. However, as these golden men sucked in more people, their bodies would slowly swell up. Some different colors were tumbling and entangling in their bodies, just like the emotions in the dreams of those who had been sucked out. After 4 to 6 hours, no matter what they looked like, their bellies were round and their facial features were squeezed into a ball. It was unspeakably funny and weird. Then, they burst open. At this time, the roar in the northeast of the city of Wei had not stopped. It seemed that morning had arrived in advance on that side of the sky. Behind the mountains there was a faint red light like the morning glow. But in fact it was the mountain fire, the rolling mountain fire like a giant dragon, and the continuous roar. In such a roar these golden men burst open. The yang energy that had been sucked out of their bodies should have dissipated, but it suddenly flowed along a strange track on the streets of the city of Wei. It was not entirely true to say that it flowed along the streets and alleys. Sometimes it would pass through walls and houses. But the yang energy that had been sucked out was like the first bowl of water in an old-fashioned well. With this bowl of water, the water in the well could be continuously drawn out. The yang energy that contained all kinds of emotions flowed on the streets and gradually converged into a stream. It led more and more yang energy from the people in the city of Wei to flow out of the houses. Finally, it gradually converged into a thicker torrent. If the people who had secretly followed Li Yunxin through the streets and alleys in the past 3 days were still awake and could open their yin-yang eyes, they would have realized when they saw the flood of yang qi. The places where they flowed were all places that Li Yunxin had set foot on. For example, a small stream flowed by the Willow River and rolled over a slate. There was an inconspicuous pattern on the slate and then it lit up. This was the pattern that Li Yunxin had engraved with the weasel hairbrush in his hand that day. At that time he said that the sun was good, so he wanted to draw the sun. His drawing was abstract and clumsy, and he only finished half of it before he threw the brush away. Such a pattern, after being hit by the yang energy, lit up. Because of the light and guidance, the torrent of yang energy branched out and constructed a mysterious but orderly circuit. This thing was something that any physician would find to be familiar with. It was the meridian diagram of Zhou Xian. And there were 35 similar things in the entire city of Wei. On such a night, more than 30 miles away from the city of Wei, in a small temple in the Yao village by the Wei River, the temple attendant was still awake. This was a small temple, but it was full of incense. There was only one hall, 1 yard, and 2 wing rooms. Usually, the temple attendant Taoist Hong Song would have gone to bed long ago. But tonight he was startled by the rumbling thunder and the mountain fire in the distance. He put on his clothes and pushed the door into the yard. He walked through the watery moonlight and the mottled shadows of the trees, and finally reached the door of the main hall. Annoyed, he decided to meditate in the main hall. The hall enshrined the newly acquired supreme and holy spiritual treasures, the statues of Crown Prince Zhou and the red-dressed dragon lady, by a master. At first he was reluctant, but after offering the portraits he was convinced. This statue indeed had the effect of calming the mind and clearing the heart. Not to mention that there was the spiritual aura of the gods on it. Even if there wasn't, the effect of the painting itself was enough to make him treasure it. Moreover, he was born with yin and yang eyes. He could see ghosts. Ghosts were not common, but there were always ghosts who loved the incense in the temple and would come to him. When he sat in the hall at night with this portrait, the ghosts did not dare to come close. But tonight, when he walked to the main hall and looked inside, he found a faint light in the room. He immediately suspected that the ruffians in the village were jealous of this statue and dared to steal it. He looked around and found a short wooden stick half covered in the mud by the wall. Holding it in his hand, he strode up the stone steps and pushed the door open. However, before the words, "Thief, how dare you," could escape his throat, he froze on the spot. After 2 breaths, the short stick in his hand fell on the mud with a clang. Taoist Hong Song knelt down and did not dare to raise his head. He only said, "Immortal has shown his divinity. Immortal has shown his divinity. I should die 10,000 times for being alarmed." Just after he pushed the door open, he saw a golden god walking down from the portrait. He only took a glance but did not see clearly. So he did not realize that the appearance of this god was 70% similar to Li Yunxin. The golden shadow, formed by the power of incense and wishes of the believers, slowly walked forward with the little spiritual aura that belonged to Li Yunxin in the painting. Without looking at Taoist Hong Song, it directly passed through the door and rushed towards the direction of the city of Wei. It was also at this moment that a golden figure walked out from each of the 37 statues that he had distributed and were worshipped in various temples. Carrying his spiritual qi, they converged in the city of Wei. And this city of Wei, if Ling Kongzi had been suspicious that day and had flown high up in the sky to look at the route Li Yunxin had taken during those few days and had drawn it out, he would have discovered. He used his own footsteps to measure a lifelike portrait of Li Yunxin, with the entire city of Wei as the center. The unfinished and playful strokes that he left in various places in the city, whether intentionally or unintentionally, formed the 36 major acupuncture points in the meridians of the human body. And the yamen of the prefectural magistrate that hid the rare scroll of the Shangyun painting was the heart of this painting. Now, the yang energy of 360,000 people in the city of Wei had been guided by the 36 major acupuncture points, forming the flowing meridians. And the 37 golden immortals with Li Yunxin's spiritual aura successively threw themselves into the circulation of the meridians. Yang energy, spiritual aura, and torrent, after 3 circulations, finally rushed towards the yamen of the prefectural magistrate. Chapter 114. The office of the magistrate of the city of Wei had a history of 443 years. It used to be the Jiangyi prefecture of the previous dynasty, which was in charge of the crimes and robberies in the capital. After the current dynasty conquered the city of Wei and established the government office, the administrative center of the city was still here. This government office had ruled the city of Wei for more than 300 years, and had long become the most important part of the city's feng shui. Without this government office, the yang qi and human flow of the entire city of Wei would not be smooth. Thieves and robbers would be everywhere, lawsuits would not be filed, and the people would not be able to live. Therefore, in the feng shui of the city of Wei, besides the power of suppression, there was also the power of vitality. The yang qi that formed the exquisite circulation of meridians rolled over, and 36 of the 37 golden immortals had already thrown themselves into the 36 major acupoints, becoming the acupoint guards. Only one immortal stood on the waves of the torrent, and was surrounded all the way to the front of the government office. What a good immortal! He looked 70% like Li Yunxin, and his face was as calm as water. He wore a golden armor and was surrounded by colorful lights, like a real immortal, shining with golden light. Yang qi surrounded him, accompanied by the sounds of laughter and crying. It was like a group of demons dancing wildly, like guards wielding weapons protecting him. Although he was at the door, he could not enter, because the door of the government office suddenly opened, and out walked a general who was more than 10 feet tall and was wearing a golden armor. Beside the general there were hundreds of guards with bows and swords, approaching Li Yunxin and shouted, "Who are you, breaking into the government office at night?" Li Yunxin did not speak, but the dancing demons around him had all turned into the appearance of the people of the city of Wei. The voices of thousands of men, women, old and young converged and shouted in unison, "I came with the yang qi of 300,000 people in the city of Wei. Today I will use the government office to suppress my spirit, become a true god and rebuild my Dharmakaya. How dare you stop me?" But the general only said, "As the general of the government office of the city of Wei, I was born because of the feng shui of the city of Wei, and I guard the capital of the city of Wei against external evil. Why can't I stop you?" The thousands of illusions around Li Yunxin shouted, "As the commanding general of the city of Wei, do you know that you are guarding the people, humanity and fate of this city, not a mansion, a government office or a person? If the city of Wei doesn't exist, the people don't exist, and the fate of humanity doesn't exist, then what's the point of having you as the governor and the general? Where did you get the power of the capital and the power of the emperor? It was the billions of people in the world who gave you their power and fate to protect the people of this city. Now you're standing in front of my 300,000 people's fate. Is your Dharmakaya foundation still there?" As soon as he said this, the divine light around the golden-armored general suddenly dimmed, and the personal guards beside him fell silent. A moment later, the great general silently moved to the side. The personal guards around him scattered. All of them went into hiding. However, the door of the magistrate's office was still tightly shut. Even the Dharmakaya formed by his spiritual power and yang qi could not penetrate the solemn and imposing aura outside the door. Li Yunxin shouted, "Where are the beggars? May you live forever." After shouting like this 3 times, there was finally some change in the magistrate's office. In the magistrate's study, the old man on the Xiangyuan painting heard the shout and moved. At the first sound he stretched his muscles and bones. At the second sound his body suddenly expanded and he walked out of the painting. At the third sound he seemed to wake up from a dream. He turned around on the spot and suddenly opened his eyes wide. He only said, "The immortals promised me, the immortals promised me." Then the man in the painting ran straight to the gate of the magistrate's office. Although it was an illusion, just like the green armored swordsman that Li Yunxin painted to kill, it could also be touched. He reached out his hand and pushed the door open. As soon as he saw Li Yunxin, he kneeled on the ground and said, "The immortals promised me immortality." Li Yunxin walked straight into the mansion with his head held high and said, "I will reward you in the future." Then he passed through the front yard and entered the hall of the magistrate's office. After a brief inspection, he walked to the official chair behind the hall. He sat down. At this moment, the golden light, the human figure, and the laughter and crying that surrounded him suddenly disappeared. Like a cloud, they were all absorbed into his body in an instant. And the illusion of the Lord of Immortals also gradually turned from a transparent light shadow to a real light flow. This light flow flowed in his body for a while, and finally condensed into a real substance. So this newly born Li Yunxin, who looked no different from when he was alive, slowly picked up the gavel on the table and slammed it on the table. With this sound, all the yang qi in the city of Wei rushed into his body. With the prestige of the magistrate's office accumulated for 400 years, his spirit finally settled down. The portrait of Li Yunxin, which was made up of all the streets and alleys in the city of Wei, trembled violently at this moment because of the sound of his heart. It affected the vital energy of 300,000 people. So, the people woke up. Li Yunxin sat alone in the dark and spacious hall. After a moment of silence he said, "With the opportunity of reconstructing my Dharmakaya, I have solved your problem. Don't forget to thank me in the future." A big ghost with a face like melon skin bowed into the hall and said in a muffled voice, "Why do you say so? I am the Lord, how can I go back on my words?" Li Yunxin pointed at the ghost of the old beggar who had been waiting outside the door. "You are the same kind. I promised him immortality. Since this is the case, I can't let him be a lonely ghost. My Dharmakaya has just been formed and has not returned to the position of the dragon sun. I need a few days to cultivate and accumulate mana. Since you have recovered your previous memory, I will give it to you for now. When you have done that thing in the future, you can make him the god of earth and mountain. Then it will not be a waste of his relationship with me. Is this okay?" The big ghost voice was like a bell. "Of course. You can rest assured." Li Yunxin got up and walked down the hall. "Then go quickly. Don't delay your business. I have my own business to do." After saying this, he went straight out of the door. There was still one last thing to do. People were alive because of the yang qi. The circulation of qi in the meridians of the human body gave birth to the yang qi. Therefore people could walk and jump. They could even refine the yang qi into spiritual qi. This was a cultivator. He used the city of Wei as a painting scroll and spent 3 days to paint the city with his spirit. This was to prepare for death. When a person died, his body would be destroyed and his spirit would become a ghost. Even if he cultivated as a ghost again, he would be like the big ghost, always muddle-headed. Moreover, he knew that Lu Ling would never let his ghost go. Therefore, in those 3 days he had actually used the entire city of Wei to paint another version of himself. Coming back from the dead, seizing the fortune of yin and yang. He used the scrolls that were scattered in those days as a guide to draw out the 7 emotions and 6 desires of people and the yang qi. They circulated in the painting and actually formed the qi of the body. Then he called back the spiritual qi clones that were filled with the wishes of the villagers. At this point the body was complete. Then he made the beggar who wanted immortality open the door of the government office. He slapped the gavel that had the merit of stabilizing the city. The heart of the new body started to beat. With the yang qi of 300,000 people in the city and the wishes of countless villagers, he finally seized the fortune of heaven and earth and forcibly reconstructed a Dharmakaya for him. This was the method that White Impermanence told him that night. Knowing this method, he spent several days laying out the plan and finally succeeded. Right now he was like the green armored swordsman, painted by him. With his unparalleled understanding of his own details, qi and the flow of spiritual qi in his body, he used the yang qi of 300,000 people as his brush and ink, and the big city as his painting scroll. He created a Dharmakaya. But such a Dharmakaya could not last long. The existence of everything in the world was predetermined. Right now he was a character that was created out of thin air. He needed an empty. That was the empty of the dragon sun, or in other words, Godhead. The entire city of Wei had woken up. Everyone gradually realized that something extremely strange had happened tonight. They all fell asleep at the same time. But in the future people would blame this matter on the gods and demons or the Dragon King. Even after a long time, when the fear had disappeared, they would brag about this matter to outsiders. But tonight was still a little chaotic. They first woke up at home to see if their families were okay. Then they dared to slowly walk out of the street. Because in the northeast of the city of Wei, the rumbling and fire had not stopped. They didn't know that it was a cultivator at the peak of the transcendent state, who had many magic treasures, fighting against a powerful demon. But gradually, they realized that the place where the fire was located was actually very far away from the city of Wei. So, of course they wanted to watch the show. That night the streets were filled with a strange atmosphere. And in this lively atmosphere, a handsome man in white walked through the streets and alleys. Soon he arrived at the Taoshi Road, which had collapsed halfway. Many people died here. Not counting the officials who had been killed by Yunxin, there were many people buried in the collapsed houses. But such a scene was not deserted at all, and there were more people than other places. Some were here to watch the show, some were here to help their families, some wanted to save people, and some wanted to take advantage of the chaos to find some belongings of the dead. When Li Yunxin walked through the crowd toward the ruins of the Dragon King Temple, he saw a ground full of dead souls. The way they died was too horrible to look at, almost turned into minced meat. Standing on the ruins, they wandered back and forth. Occasionally they would pounce on people but they couldn't touch them. He ignored them, walked a few more steps and saw the ruins of the Dragon King temple. The small pond was filled with gravel and a corpse was lying on the ground. A few idlers were rummaging through the ruins of the main building of the Dragon King temple, but they didn't find anything. Li Yunxin walked to the corpse and carefully looked at it with the help of the moonlight and the light of the torches in the idlers' hands. After staring at it for a while, 2 idlers noticed him and came over saying, "We haven't touched this corpse yet. It's not yours. Be sensible and leave." However, Li Yunxin ignored him and continued to stare at the corpse. After looking for a while, he sighed sincerely in a low voice. The 2 idlers exchanged glances and were about to beat him away. But hearing his words, they couldn't help but frown. "What did you say?" At this time, Li Yunxin, who had been looking down at the face of the corpse, turned his neck 180 degrees, showing his snow-white teeth to the 2 idlers and said softly, "I mean really handsome." The 2 were stunned at first, because this face was exactly the same as the face of the corpse on the ground. Then they noticed the fact that this person originally had his back to them. But at this time his body didn't move but his face was facing them. A burst of numbness from their tailbone all the way to the top of their heads. The 2 were so scared that they didn't even make a sound and turned around to run. But Li Yunxin reached out and grabbed one of them, knocking him unconscious on the ground. The idlers didn't know why the person suddenly ran away in the ruins with his hands and feet. But they only saw Li Yunxin knocking the other one unconscious. For a moment they only knew that something had happened, but they couldn't decide whether to leave or not. After all, they didn't fight with the person who hit them. So they just stood and watched from a distance and then made a decision. They saw the young man in white squatting down, groping the corpse on the ground for a while. Then he exerted his strength and pulled out a black soft armor from under the corpse's blood-stained clothes. The corpse moved because of his rough movement, its head tilted to one side and its eyes opened, staring at the people not far away. Seeing them made his scalp tingle. He felt that the person who searched the corpse was a bit evil and was about to leave, but he suddenly saw the person shake the software in his hand. It didn't change. The person thought for a while and shook it a few more times. Finally, with a flash of green light, the soft armor disappeared. Seeing this scene, the people were shocked. They wanted very much to see how he had managed to get away with such a large object. Perhaps they were dazzled by the darkness of the night. They saw the person in white spread out his hand and a dark scale-like thing appeared in his hand. He breathed a sigh of relief, put the thing in his hand into his bosom, pressed it hard and put it somewhere. Then he squatted down. The torch in the hand of the person who was knocked unconscious fell to the ground, and fell on a cluster of thin bamboos. Although it was the end of spring, the green bamboos and the ground was muddy, but the torch was made of tung oil. In such a short time the torch had ignited the thin bamboos. It was like a bonfire. They saw that the expression of the person in white was a little strange. It seemed that inside his body, under his skin, something was about to grow and break out and he was trying hard to suppress it. He opened his mouth with some difficulty, but it seemed that he was afraid of dislocating his jaw, so he held it with his hand and then pressed it back. Then, it seemed that from the gap between his fingers, a white curved knife popped out. But the bonfire was getting stronger and there was some smoke so it couldn't be seen clearly. He held the knife and with the other hand he grabbed the arm of the unconscious man, and made a cut. He cut off a piece of bloody flesh. This time the people saw it clearly. 2 of the more courageous ones immediately stepped forward with torches in their hands and shouted, "We're all here to make money from the dead, why do we have to kill people?" But the person ignored them. He used the curved knife in his hand to skewer the flesh and put it on the fire to roast. The 2 people were dumbfounded and after a while they stepped forward again and wanted to kick the person away to save the man, saying, "You are crazy." But after 2 steps they didn't dare to move forward anymore. Because they finally saw clearly that the curved knife, in the person's hand, was actually a sharp and ferocious fingernail protruding from his finger. At this moment he brought the piece of flesh pierced by the fingernail to his mouth. With his white, slightly sharp teeth. He bit it. The 2 people were scared out of their wits. They wanted to turn around and run, but their legs didn't listen to them at all. They felt their lower abdomen contracting and swelling, and they were so scared that they were about to lose control of themselves. Because they saw that the person's eyes had turned golden, and there was only a thin black line in his eyes. It was a monster. But the next moment, in the ruins of the temple next to the bonfire, the person threw away the piece of flesh. The ferocious fingernail retracted, the sharp teeth in his mouth became flat, and his eyes turned black again. He sighed. Fortunately, I don't want to eat people. Then he stood up and waved his hand, and the corpse that belonged to him on the ground was smashed into a bloody paste. Seeing this scene, the two shivering people with teeth chattering finally felt warmth in their crotches, and knelt on the ground with a thud. As for those further away, they hated their parents for not giving them 2 more legs. Ignoring the bruises on their faces in the ruins, they screamed in horror and ran far away. The two knelt on the ground and kept kowtowing, saying, "Great Immortal, please spare us, we have old people and young people in our family. But after kowtowing for a long time there was no response. When they gathered their courage to look again, there was no one in front of them. That person, he had already left the city and stood beside the surging Wei River. The Wei River looked even more majestic in the night. The flames in the northeast illuminated the river slightly. The surging and roaring water stirred up a thick fog, shrouding the boundless river like an illusion. Water vapor evaporated the lush and verdant reeds, calamus and water masses with fine leaves on both sides of the river, emitting a rich fragrance in the night wind. The sound of flowing water filled the entire world, and even the rumbling sounds on the other side became weak and inaudible. The surging river, thousands of miles in an instant, nourished all things. Now, it belonged to him. Xianxia stood on the gentle slope and let out a light breath in the night. I am Wei River Dragon King. Chapter 115. The west wind blows the old Dongting and her hair turns white overnight. After getting drunk, she doesn't know the sky is in the water and the boat is full of clear dreams. The embers have all been extinguished. This was originally a grassy slope, a gentle slope in the vast wilderness mountain range located 40 miles away from the city of Wei. It used to be lush with vegetation and towering ancient trees. There were giant trees in the forest and countless birds and beasts. Even people who have lived in the mountains all their lives dare not go too deep, because they may get lost. There are so many beasts in the forest. A little carelessness will lead to death. But now, the wilderness mountain crossed the mountain ridges near the city of Wei and had completely changed its appearance. It seems that there is a rain of fire from the sky, or lava erupting from the ground. Within a radius of more than 10 miles, there is no grass, birds or beasts. The ground is covered with black ash. Occasionally there are dried tree branches that have not been burned out. When the wind blows, they are on fire again. Smoke rises in the area that is hard to see, like a crater that is about to erupt. Lu Ling is standing here like a straight tree. She has changed beyond recognition. Her hair is untied and there is no jewelry on her head. Her long black hair falls down and reaches her waist. The pink palace dress on her body is also gone, leaving only a white silk underwear. Her smooth and slender legs are exposed. Her bare feet step in the ashes, trembling slightly. But it is not because of fear but because of exhaustion. Now she is holding the last magic weapon on her body, the tone bell on her wrist. An hour ago she had given up the pink nighthang dress she was wearing. Such a magic weapon is pushed to the limit and then explodes. It instantly destroys everything within a radius of 3 or 4 miles. Even the soil on the ground is peeled off a thick layer. But the damage to Bai Yunxin is only, it tears her clothes. Now Lu Ling is holding the last magic weapon in her hand, feeling that her ocean of qi and mountain of snow has been squeezed to the limit. She still has the last strength to push this magic weapon to explode. But now the only thing she hesitates is to explode or to kill herself. She has heard a lot about demons and she knows that it will not end well if she falls into the hands of demons. But, what are you? Her voice trembled not because of fear but because of exhaustion. What exactly is it? But Bai Yunxin just looked at her like a beast waiting for an opportunity to pounce, slowly circling around her like a cat playing with its prey. The expression on her face was calm and steady as if she was just playing. Dragon Little 9. Did you know? She said softly, there's nothing fun here. Dragon Little 9 is the most fun. It's thin and long. It's very tough on the inside and brittle on the outside. As she spoke, she stopped in front of Lu Ling, only 1 step away from her. Her eyes seemed to have turned dark due to excitement. There was only black, no mascara. And stupid, not like his brothers and sisters. She licked her lips with her slender pink tongue. However, he quickly realized that it was inappropriate and quickly retracted his hand. Oh, so I can only eat him. But you killed him. Bai Yunxin suddenly screamed, her voice piercing through the clouds. She stuck close to Lu Ling and stared at her. 2 breaths later, blood flowed out of Lu Ling's ears in a winding fashion. Yin Ling fell to the ground with a clang. She had subconsciously used the last of her spiritual power to protect her heart from being shaken to death. But now she began to regret. She should have died. Now she could hardly move. Bai Yunxin stared at her for a while, then suddenly retracted her head and took 2 steps back. When that, Li Yunxin. She frowned slightly and seemed to be angry. His smell is, she blinked quickly and thought for a while, then said, it smells good. The smell of his soul, it's fresh and fragrant and a little spicy. I've never smelled something like that before. But you killed him. She abruptly turned around and pressed her lips against Lu Ling's ear as she screamed shrilly once again. Lu Ling swayed and fell straight to the ground. A big cloud of gray smoke rose around her. Her ocean of qi and mountain of snow had been shattered. 2 fun and delicious things were destroyed by you. She seemed to be getting angrier. Then I'm going home. But my feather robe. It was stolen by you stinky Taoists. I could have found it, but I gave it to a little Taoist like you to bring it out. Now tell me, where is my feather robe? She squatted down and stared at Lu Ling. However, at this moment Lu Ling could only stare at her. The white of her eyes began to turn red. Her ocean of qi and mountain of snow were destroyed, which meant that her cultivation was destroyed. There were many ways to cripple one's cultivation and still let one live like an ordinary person, but it was definitely not this one. Her eyelids began to tremble rapidly. Blood gushed out from her throat and soon went back into her lungs. Bai Yunxin frowned and stood up. So annoying. She kicked Lu Ling fiercely several times. Seeing that she was no longer moving, she seemed to be relieved and jumped down the mountain briskly. At this moment, Lu Laodao was sitting on a stone slab in the ruins of the Dragon King Temple. His hair was disheveled, his face was stained with mud, and his Taoist robe was torn in several places. The people who took him away at night had a conscience. After taking all the money from him, they left him in an alley. When he woke up in the morning and walked back, he found that the whole Taoshi road had been changed beyond recognition. It took him some time to recognize the place, and then he saw the blood all over the ground. He had been sitting in this pile of broken bricks and tiles. There was no sound in the northeast, and the fire had been extinguished. After another hour, Lao Dao felt thirsty. There was a woman crying nearby. Her voice was intermittent and annoying. There were also 2 people sitting in the ruins next to him. They probably didn't know what to do. The old Taoist raised his sleeve and wiped his eyes. He rummaged through a pile of rubble for a while before he found 3 sticks of incense that were uneven but not soaked in water. Then he spent another quarter of an hour to find a match and lit the 3 incense sticks. They were inserted into the dark brown muddy ground. Then he sat back and stared at the rising smoke from the 3 incense sticks. He gradually felt that his back was hot from the rising sun. But soon Lao Dao heard footsteps again. The soles of his shoes rubbed against the coarse rubble, making a clattering sound. The person walked through the ruins and finally stepped on the muddy ground. He took a few steps forward and put out the 3 incense sticks. Lu Laodao raised his head blankly and saw that the person had a happy and complicated smile on his face. His hand was pressed on the hilt of the sword at his waist. He even stepped on the ground with a pair of official boots. Then he spat on the ground and said, Good death. This scourge. It's not enough to kill him. We can't do without you, old coffin. Chapter 116. Lao Dao was stunned for a moment before he said, Spectre. Brother Exin, he's dead. Yin Pingji rubbed the ground with his feet and looked around. Death is too easy for him. From what I see, these. He raised his left arm and drew a circle around him. These families are ruined because of him. He's not a good person, a demon. Maybe he's a demon. Anyone who's involved with him won't be able to live a good life. You brought this evil Taoist into the city and killed so many people, including my niece. I'm going to kill you and rid this world of evil. As Yin Pingji said this, he exerted force on his wrist. He unsheathed his saber, revealing the bright edge of the blade that reflected the sunlight. Lao Dao narrowed his eyes. Lu Lao Dao raised his hand to block, saying, "If you want to kill me to vent your anger, just jump over and kill me." "Why, say this. Lao Dao, I think you're afraid. You're afraid that Brother Exin isn't dead yet. If you act rashly, you won't be able to turn the situation around, am I right?" Yin Pingji frowned. He looked around and sneered, "Not dead? Someone told me that a white-clothed demon smashed his corpse last night. Why isn't he dead?" Lao Dao sighed. "If that's the case, Inspector Yin, do it." Yin Pingji gritted his teeth, his cheeks tightened. He took 2 steps closer to Lu Lao Dao and pulled out his saber. "You think I don't dare to kill you?" Lao Dao reached out and picked up a fist-sized rock from the side. He held it in his hand and looked up at Yin Pingji. "Inspector Yin. Lao Dao, I've heard of your reputation before. They say that you're a man with deep thoughts. You're a forthright person, but you're also decisive in your actions. But as for your niece, you can't be sure if she's been harmed by Brother Exin. Now I'm also afraid that Brother Exin is still alive and will seek revenge on you. But even so, you still want to tangle with me, Lao Dao. How could a person like you lose his mind and do such a thing?" At this point, Lao Dao sighed. "Don't tell me you've gone against the rules of human relationships and started having feelings for your niece?" As soon as he said this, Yin Pingji's expression suddenly changed. First, his body swayed and then he slashed with his saber. "I'll chop you up, you old coffin." This slash used up all of the man's strength, drawing a beautiful arc in the air. But in the next moment he fell to the ground with a thud. Lu Lao Dao weighed the fist-sized rock in his hand again. The rock was stained with blood. Yin Pingji fell to the ground with his eyes wide open as if he couldn't understand. He had been a constable for many years and had caught countless robbers. How could he be smashed by this old man? How could this old man have such great strength and speed? He felt dizzy as if there was a big hole in his forehead. Light, sound, and wind were all pouring into it. He could only vaguely hear Lao Dao say something like, "Brother Xian's heart-piercing technique." Then he saw the rock in Lu Lao Dao's hand smash down again. Lu Lao Dao smashed it another 7 or 8 times without holding back. He had practiced the water cloud force taught by Li Yunxin. Although it had only been a month, he could already feel the power of the divine heart technique. These 7 or 8 hits completely dented Yin Pingji's head. Then Lao Dao threw the rock away and spat. "I'll let you step on it." Then he looked around as if he had just woken up from a dream. The sun rose to the middle of the sky. The bright sunlight made him dizzy. A few people not far away stood up and stared at him in shock. Lu Lao Dao felt his mouth was even drier. A wave of anxiety rose from the bottom of his heart and made his chest feel stuffy. He turned around twice and found a few people were also looking at him. But when they met his eyes, they looked away as if they were afraid of him. He bent down and tore off a large piece of cloth from Yin Pingji's body to make a bag. Then he found a few things from the ruins and put them in the bag and tied it on his back. In fact, they were all inexplicable small things. For example, half a porcelain plate, a wine cup, and a corner of a straw mat on the Kong bed. He didn't know why he picked them up, but he felt more secure with them on his back. There was always something familiar with him. Then Lu Lao Dao left the city of Wei where he had lived for decades. When he was in the city, he walked very fast, afraid that someone would catch him. But in fact, no one paid attention to him. Even if someone reported him to the authorities, they didn't have the energy to deal with a single murder case. After all, there were too many things to deal with. So he smoothly left the city. Out of the city, he walked on the official road for an hour and turned into a small road. Li Yunxin had walked this road before. He walked along the road until he reached the pier by the Wei River. But halfway through, Lao Dao turned to another road in the east. This road was close to the Wei River and was full of water vapor. The trees on both sides were lush and green. The leaves of the forest covered the sky above the road, and only occasional specks of sunlight leaked through. He walked on the boulevard for a while. The heat from the long journey gradually disappeared, and he felt refreshed and comfortable. After walking for a while, he saw a jujube tree by the roadside. The flowers had withered and only green dates the size of a thumb grew. He walked over and pulled down one branch and slowly picked the jujubes on it to eat. He put the jujubes into his mouth one by one, and from time to time spit out the beard that he had eaten. The green juice was all over his mouth, and the unformed seeds in the jujubes were also eaten. He just stood there and ate in one breath, and the jujubes on the branch were all gone. He loosened his hand and the branch bounced back. Lu Laodao continued on his way. He felt his mouth sour and saliva flowing, and he didn't seem as thirsty as before. His stomach was filled with something and it wasn't very empty. But his heart still felt empty. It was as if he was floating in the air, lacking something to support him. He felt flustered, so he used his right hand to cover his chest and continued on his way. After walking for a while, the small road entered the wilderness. The trees gradually became lush and there were more towering trees. The sunlight was blocked out and the light became darker. Lao Dao suddenly stopped walking and remembered that when he first met Li Yunxin he was kidnapped into the forest. So he stared at the dense forest in the distance for a while. Then he raised his other hand and covered his face with his sleeve, and at last the 60-year-old man began to weep in the field. There was no one in the wilderness and the old man kept crying. After crying for a quarter of an hour he finally stopped crying and wiped his face with his palm, then rubbed his face again and blew his nose. Then he pulled a handful of grass from the side of the road, wiped his hands, took a deep breath and continued on his way. Lu Laodao walked like this for 6 hours without stopping and finally reached the foot of a small mountain. Although it was a small mountain, it was still 300 to 400 meters high. The top of the mountain was also shrouded in a faint mist, and it had a very dusty feeling. A half-collapsed stone tablet was hidden in the weeds, and a small road climbed up to the waist of the mountain. Lu Laodao pushed the grass aside and saw the words South Mountain carved on the tablet, and the gaps between the words were filled with mud. He turned around and walked up the mountain. After walking for another 2 hours he finally reached a small temple halfway up the mountain. Xianxia was bent over, holding a large broom and sweeping the flat ground in front of the temple. On one side of the ground were 5 or 6 beds of green vegetables, green and green. On the other side was a yellow pine tree, and one more step would lead to a cliff, shrouded in clouds and mist. Under the pine tree was a wooden table, 2 stools, and a wooden plate with half an uneaten sweet potato on it. Lao Dao stood there, looked at Xianxia for a while and spoke in a hoarse voice. My real name is Lu Gongzan and I was a bandit in my early years, nicknamed Ghost Teller. I just killed a constable and I have nowhere to go. Do you dare to let me go? After saying this, he fainted under the surprised gaze of Xianxia, who had just turned around. Note: Xianxia, Xichonghua Building, Baohua Association. Lu Laodao's confidant. Chapter 117. The surging Wei River flows down from the northwest of the city of Wei to the southeast. When it flows to the west of the city of Wei, 2 tributaries, Jinjiang River and Luoshui River, converge. The place where the 3 rivers converge is called 3 estuaries. The Wei River suddenly turns to the southeast when it reaches the 3 estuaries. Because of this turn, a big lake is formed which is called Dongting. Dongting Lake is said to be thousands of miles long, but it is actually so vast that it can almost be called a sea. There is a dense forest between Dongting and the city of Wei, called the Wilderness Forest. Although it is called a forest, it is actually very vast with a radius of thousands of miles. There are also famous mountains in the forest. Although not as tall and majestic as the mountains in the Wilderness Mountain Range in the east of the city of Wei, they are also unique. In addition to famous mountains such as Mount Jun, Mount Bi and Mount Weishan, there are also some unknown peaks such as Nanshan, Dongshan and Shaozhu Mountain. The 3 estuaries at the confluence of the 3 rivers protrude into the Dongting Lake like a sharp blade. Because of this, egrets live on the blade all year round, so it is called Egret Island. Although it is called island, it is actually a peninsula on which there are villages and farmlands, with hundreds of families living. Decades ago someone said that the Egret Island is sharp and it is like a knife inserted into the Wei River and Dongting, ruining the feng shui of the place. Therefore, a temple was built at the end of the Egret Island facing the center of the river and the mouth of the lake to protect the feng shui. This temple is the Sanheku Dragon King Temple. Li Yunxin is now standing outside the temple and he is confused about one thing. The scenery outside the temple is excellent. The temple is facing the Dongting, which is thousands of miles long. The water is shining, the sky is clear, and there is a white beach at the entrance of the water. On one side of the temple is a garden with a wooden pavilion, flowers and old trees. At this time there are several scholars sitting in the wooden pavilion, drinking and laughing, and some tourists and pilgrims come to the temple to offer incense. Most of them are talking about what happened a few days ago. A Taoshi road in the city of Wei was almost destroyed, the Dragon King showed his divinity, someone saw a monster in white eating human flesh and Inspector Yin was killed. Li Yunxin knows what Lao Dao did and he went to see him yesterday. But he did not show himself. It was not a good time. He had been to the place where Bai Yunxin and Ling Kongzi fought, and he had also been to the residence of the Shanqing Danding sect in the city of Wei. The only cultivator in the city of Wei, Song Yunzi, was in a constant state of anxiety. Because the remains of Fairy Ling Kongzi of the Langya Grotto Heaven were in the residence. He was trying his best to keep the shell from rotting while he waited for the people from the Grotto Heaven to investigate. At the same time he was worried that the people from the Grotto Heaven would vent their anger on him. All cultivators knew what it meant to have a peak of transcendent state who was less than 20 years old. But now he died in the city of Wei. This was good news for Li Yunxin, from an objective point of view. However, Bai Yunxin's strength was beyond his imagination. She had become a huge variable in his plan. Originally, the two of them should have been mutually wounded, and he would have gone to reap the harvest. But now the theoretically perfect plan had gone awry, and the situation had derailed. Several people saw him in the city of Wei. He should have killed two of them and used one of them as a puppet to settle this matter. But he couldn't kill them. Anyone who died without the help of others had the risk of being exposed and he couldn't kill dozens of them. In that case he might as well send himself to Daotong. What the people of Daotong knew was that Ling Kongzi had killed Long Sun and Li Yunxin. And Bai Yunxin had killed Ling Kongzi. Now he would also realize that there was a monster at the scene of the accident. He was definitely involved. Li Yunxin realized that he had to find someone to take the blame. He had been thinking about this for 2 days and now someone came to him. In the original plan he was going to die. He would let Lu Ling kill the 9th young master and then let Lu Ling kill him. After killing him, Lu Ling would definitely destroy his soul. At this point no one would doubt that his soul was really gone. To kill the 9th young master he used the sword that Bai Yunxin gave him. To kill him he used the sword that Bai Yunxin gave him. During this period he used the sword to cut off his finger, which was to lure her. The soft armor and the sword were made of the monster's scales and feathers, which were connected to his qi dynamic. Bai Yunxin gave him the sword so that she could find him in the future. In the end he and Lu Ling delayed for a long time and finally Bai Yunxin came. So he wanted the two to fight and he went to possession. In fact, the moment he was killed by Lu Ling the plan was completed. The most difficult part was to kill the 9th young master. Lu Ling was very powerful and he easily achieved this. The 9th young master or the whole dragons or all the mythological beasts were different from all the other creatures in the world. For example, humans had a body and a spirit. Although the two were combined, there was still a soul after the death of the body. If the body was damaged, the spirit might not be damaged. If the spirit was damaged, the body might not be damaged. However, the mythological beasts only had a dharmakaya. The body was the spirit and the spirit was the body. A body could change into its original shape and it could also change into a human shape. If the spirit was strong, the body would be very strong. If the body was damaged, the spirit would be damaged. Therefore, when the 9th young master or the mythological beasts died, they died completely. Not even a ghost was left. Although there was no ghost, there was emptiness. Li Yunxin called it Godhead. He didn't know how many people in the world knew this secret, but his parents never mentioned it. It seemed that Lu Ling didn't know it either. Bai Yanjun told him this secret. Therefore, possession of the dragon son was actually a very simple thing. Godhead was like an official position. The name of this position was Qi Wen. After the death of the 9th young master, this official position was empty. But this thing was like fortune and luck. It was illusory. You couldn't see a chair, an empty space, or a golden seal. You needed a key. The 9th young master gave his reverse scale to Li Yunxin, but it actually became Li Yunxin's possession. He died, but the soft armor was kept. This was the key. He integrated this key into his body made of yang qi and spiritual power, and then opened the door, which was the official position. He became Qi Wen. He wasn't sure whether the 9th young master was the original Qi Wen of the first generation. But he was clear that he was indeed Qi Wen. Except for appearance and memory, he had nothing to do with his original self. But for Li Yunxin this was not a terrible thing. He had even experienced more terrible things. For example, time travel. He was already a divine beast, or a demon, so he needed the power of faith. Because the original ninth young master was dead, the 37 portraits had lost his spiritual qi. Because the original Wei River Dragon King was also dead, the statues in the temple that used to worship the former Wei River Dragon King also lost their spiritual qi. But Li Yunxin didn't want to expose himself before things were clear. Today he came here just for sightseeing. But when he came to the front of the Xianxia Dragon King temple, he found the statue that should have been empty. It was taken by someone else. This made him very confused. Chapter 118. In fact, this was also an unusual and ordinary thing. In this world there were many taboos for mortals. For example, don't talk about ghosts and gods at night, and don't worship anything in human form. After a long time of talking and worshipping, the power of vow would be generated. When the power of vow was strong enough, it could attract the Yin god, which was called evil summoning. The Yin god was not a god, but something that did not belong to humans and had some dharma power. It could be a wild ghost that lingered in the world of the living, or a monster that had just gained intelligence. You didn't know if it would attract good or bad things, so it was troublesome. A place like the Xianxia Dragon King temple was a good place for the Yin god. The ninth young master was dead, and the spiritual qi on the clay statue dissipated. Mortals could not feel it, so they still came to worship. But the Yin god could know that this place had no owner. But even so, cats and dogs did not dare to take over the statue because this place used to belong to the Dragon Son and the Wei River Dragon King. Maybe it was because the Dragon Son was not satisfied with the offerings, so he took back the spiritual qi. Or rather, even if the Dragon Son was no longer here, there would still be equally powerful demons and monsters who would come to fight over this treasured land. Anyone with a clear mind wouldn't be in such a hurry to come here and make themselves the target of public criticism. But it was taken. Li Yunxin put on a white scholar's robe and stood in front of the temple for a while with a bamboo fan in his hand. He shook his head and laughed in his heart. As a divine beast, he could be considered as a demon, so he could distinguish some breaths. For example, he knew that the spiritual power on the statue in the temple belonged to a member of the Water Clan. It was not very powerful, but it was not low either. According to the standard of cultivators, it was at the peak of the emptiness state. It did not hide its power as if it was showing off proudly. He was at the peak of the transcendent state. The ninth young master must have been more powerful than this, but he had just taken over the position of the Dragon Son. The yang qi of 300,000 people in the city of Wei and 37 portions of incense and wish power were used to create his dharmakaya, which was barely enough. He was now a large wooden barrel that could hold a lot of water, a lot of incense and wish power. He wouldn't be in so much pain and worry about his life like before, but there wasn't much water inside. It required offerings, faith and wish power. But for the time being he had to lie low and wait for someone to take the blame. Unexpectedly, a pillow was sent to him. Li Yunxin didn't go inside. He decided to wait a little longer. He was waiting for something else to confirm his suspicions. It's afternoon, which is the best time for the scenery in this 1,000-mile Dongting. Riding on the boat, one could see the vast expanse of water. Although it was indeed magnificent, one would feel bored after looking at it for a long time. Further back, only the scenery on both sides of the Wei River couldn't compare to this place. Where the three rivers converged, the water flow was slow. Looking ahead, one can see the vast Dongting Lake. On both sides, there are beautiful and tall Mount Jun and Mount Wei. It was both forceful and elegant, and it could be said to be too beautiful to behold. Therefore, the scholars sitting in the wooden pavilion were in high spirits, and their voices gradually became louder. Li Yunxin waited for a while in peace. When he saw someone almost spilled wine when pouring, he opened the folding fan and walked over while waving gently. Who in this world doesn't like appearance? He was born with a pleasant face and his words were just right. He cupped his hands in salute and said a few witty words, and the four drunken scholars took him for an interesting scholar, and invited him to sit down with them. The four poor scholars came out with their own cups, so they didn't have much etiquette. They took a small cup from the bamboo basket beside the table and filled it for Li Yunxin. Then they began to write some nonsense poems. Li Yunxin didn't want to be famous in the literary world, so he had to be responsible for clapping his hands and cheering. When the four scholars ran out of ink and the topic gradually became cold, he asked if there were any anecdotes nearby. Of course, he was happy to hear such a topic in the awkward silence. Bragging after drinking was a man's greatest hobby, nothing else. Therefore the four of them said the same thing. Just this month, something that spread throughout the entire Egret continent. There were more than 100 families living in Egret continent, but it wasn't a village but a town, Egret town. Because there were always many tourists coming and going, this town with only one long street had many tea houses, inns and restaurants. There was a scholar in the west of the town, surnamed Du, named Zifeng, 20 years old. He also had a younger sister named Ziting. Originally his family could be considered well off. His father was a coppersmith in the town. But because there were scholars in the family, when the eldest son was born, he didn't inherit the trade but was told to study. This Du Ziwei was intelligent, but had an idle personality. When he was 15 years old, he became a scholar and didn't want to improve himself. He hung out with the idlers in the town all day, calling himself a romantic scholar. So when he was 19 years old, he still hadn't married, but both of his parents fell ill. After a year, he spent all the family's money and passed away, leaving only him and his younger sister. Du Xing was lazy, but his younger sister, Du Ziting, was hardworking. So she went to the city of Wei to work as a cook for a rich merchant. She had enough to eat 3 meals a day and occasionally helped her brother. His family declined and Du Ziwei wanted to go to school, intending to study hard in order to earn a scholarly title. So he sold the family property and moved to a small courtyard in the west of the town. Every day he shut himself in and only studied. Just like that, a strange thing happened last month. Du Ziwei's savings had to cover the expenses of writing brush, ink and paper. He also had to save it for next year's examination, so he used it sparingly. He usually ate 2 meals and only 3 on New Year's Day. Most of them were coarse grains like corn cakes and rice. During winter, Du Ziwei walked on the street and saw someone selling salted fish. He couldn't resist the temptation, so he reluctantly bought one and hung it on the beam of his house. After hanging it, he didn't eat it. Every meal he would put the salted fish on the plate, eat a mouthful of the coarse grain cake, and then lick the salted fish to eat with the salty taste. As a result, the salted fish was eaten by him for half a year and it was still intact. But last month the salted fish disappeared. Du Xing felt his heart ache, but he still couldn't understand. How did the salted fish disappear? When he slept, all the doors and windows were closed and there were no cats or mice in the house. When he woke up, the rope was still intact, but the salted fish on the beam was gone. After sighing, he read and wrote as usual and went to sleep at night. But that night, when he was half awake and about to fall asleep, he vaguely heard someone calling him from under the bed. He thought that he was dreaming and didn't pay attention to it. But the next night he heard the same call again. He sobered up and listened carefully. But he heard the voice gradually become clearer and it came from under the bed. Du Xing, I died so miserably. This time, Du Ziwei didn't feel sleepy at all. He jumped out of the bed, ran to the wall and pulled out the sword. He lifted the bed curtain and looked under the bed, but there was nothing. The next day he spent some money to invite the temple attendant of the Sanhika Dragon King Temple to come to his house to exorcise evil spirits. The Taoist priest came, sprinkled some water and performed the religious rite with a peachwood sword in his hand. Then he said some vague words and left. That night, Du Ziwei didn't hear the voice and he fell asleep unconsciously. But he had a dream. He dreamed of a middle-aged scholar who called himself Lord Dongting. He said that the salted fish was his daughter, and her original form was a small carp. Because she offended Dragon Sun, she was beaten back to her original form by Dragon Sun, and left to fend for herself in Dongting Lake. Later she was caught by fishermen and made into salted fish, which was bought by Du Ziwei. As a monster, the small carp died miserably and its body couldn't be buried, so it gathered a kind of resentment, which made its soul always attached to the salted fish. After Du Zijin licked her every day, fed her with food and channeled his human qi into her, she gradually regained her power. Yesterday she told Lord Dongting where she was in a dream, and today her father came to find her. Lord Dongting told Du Xing that he could dig under his bed. If he dug up a salted fish, he could keep it in clean water for 3 days, and then one night he would take the salted fish to Dongting Lake and turn it over 3 times. Du Xing had this dream. When he woke up, he went to dig under the bed and found a salted fish. It was the one that had been hanging on the beam. So he did as he was told. 3 days later he took the salted fish to the lake and turned it over 3 times. The salted fish turned into a big carp with red scales and jumped into the water. After nodding to him 3 times, it dived into the water and disappeared. That night Lord Dongting came to him in a dream again, saying that Du Xing had done him a great favor and that 3 days later he would give him a big reward. That was today. When Du Xing told others about this, they thought he was joking, that he was having a fit of hysteria. Du Xing was not annoyed. He only said that he could come to his house tonight so that he could know what he said was true. Hearing this, Li Yunxin blinked. This was interesting. Because the name Lord Dongting, it didn't sound like any Tom, Dick or dog. Chapter 119. When the sun was about to set, Li Yunxin was already standing by the street. Du Ziwei's current residence was just a house and a yard. The yard was just surrounded by a bamboo fence with a low bamboo door. There were some flowers and plants planted by the fence, and now they were in full bloom. But due to neglect, the crazy grass was even more luxuriant than the flowers and plants, drowning the red and yellow flowers. Just as Li Yunxin had expected, there were already a lot of people gathered here. In this era, people didn't have much entertainment, so they were naturally curious about this kind of thing. A few days ago there was a big demon in the city of Wei and people should have been in a panic. But it seemed that because the demon was so fierce, the people in Egret town didn't seem to be true. The real body of Dragon King appeared in the sky, a white crane as big as the city of Wei appeared in the night, and the whole street was destroyed. It was simply too bizarre. People were more willing to believe that the fire that night was a mountain fire, and that the street was destroyed because of the earthquake. Li Yunxin could understand this kind of mentality. This was a very common psychological phenomenon. Unless a point of view or belief was strong enough to completely destroy people's original cognition, it would only make people stubborn and strengthen their original ideas. Who would be willing to believe that there was such a terrible demon in the world, and that he was right beside them? Therefore, for the people in Egret town, which was hundreds of miles away from the city of Wei, the thing that Du Xing said was really interesting. Now Du Ziwei was standing in his yard. He spent a lot of money to buy incense table and candles, and then he placed them in the yard. On the table there was a pig's head, a sheep's head and a whole chicken's head. Then he placed 3 meat dishes and 3 vegetable dishes, and 3 cups of water and wine. Then he filled a bowl with white rice and inserted 3 high incense sticks. When the sky got darker, he lit the candles. The green smoke lingered and the candlelight was dim, which really gave a solemn atmosphere. There were about 30 or 40 people on the street, gathered outside Du Xing's yard to look at him, and only laughed at him for studying so much that he became a fool. Li Yunxin stood under an old locust tree outside the crowd looking at Du Xing. He was not bad looking. Because he didn't work in the field, his skin was white. There were no calluses on his hands, so people who were touched would feel comfortable. Thick eyebrows, big eyes and a high nose. His lips were a little thin and the distance between his eyebrows was a little narrow. But in the eyes of girls he was indeed handsome. Li Yunxin raised his hand and wiped his forehead. The people on the street all surrounded one person like stars surrounding the moon. That person was about 40 years old, wearing a yellow hat and holding a horsetail whisk in his hand. He stood on the street with his belly bulging, looking towards Du Xing's courtyard. From their conversation, Li Yunxin knew that this person was the temple attendant of the Sanhika Dragon King Temple. His Taoist name was Kuan Yongzi. Because when Du Ziwei used 3 taels of silver to invite him to do the ritual, Kuan Yongzi only said that it was an evil spirit, and that he might not be able to defeat it. Because when Du Ziwei used 3 taels of silver to invite him to do the ritual, Kuan Yongzi only said that it was an evil spirit, and that he might not be able to defeat it, so he had to try. This was the usual trick of the Taoist priests in the secular world. In fact, it was not really a trick. They didn't receive the teachings of Dao Tong or Kenzo, so they learned some unorthodox techniques, so they didn't know the profoundness of it. They only learned from their ancestors saying, it should be like this, it should be like that. When they performed the technique, sometimes it was effective, sometimes it was completely useless, saying, I can't defeat it. But when Du Ziwei heard the Lord Dongting's dream, he said that the temple attendant Kuan Yongzi's skill was not good enough, that he mistook a deity's daughter for an evil spirit, and almost caused him to miss a good opportunity. Because of this, Kuan Yongzi stood outside Du Xing's door, looking at him coldly. Some idlers came up to him and asked him if tonight's matter was true or false, but he just sneered and didn't say anything. The idlers couldn't get an answer, so a woman came to ask him. He didn't answer, so the woman got angry and made a move to pull his robe, saying, "This Taoist's face looks so unlucky, it's because his lover didn't serve him well last night." The group of idlers on the side laughed and made fun of him. Kun Yongzi glared at the woman several times and the woman became even angrier. He could only awkwardly take a few steps away and said, "Fine, fine, I'll tell you." He glanced at Du Xing, who was kneeling in front of the table, and laughed coldly. "What are you talking about, Lord Dongting? I, Kun Yongzi, have been in charge of the Sanheku Dragon King Temple for 15 years. This temple is a big one near the city of Wei. A few days ago the Baohua Association in the city of Wei invited people, and they also sent me an invitation. But that day I had to go out, so it was delayed. Otherwise I, Kun Yongzi, would also be an honored guest of the Langya Cave." Hearing him say this, although these people didn't know about the Langya Cave, they still knew about the cave, and they all gasped in surprise. The woman withdrew her hand and didn't dare to pull him anymore. Kun Yongzi said again, "This big temple of mine. It worships the Wei River Dragon King. What did Du Ziwei say?" He said, "The daughter of the Lord Dongting offended the dragon son, so she was turned into a carp. Ridiculous. I've worshipped the Wei River Dragon King for so many years. When have I ever heard of the dragon son? Where is this Lord Dongting? I've never heard of him." For a moment these people were scared speechless by him. After a while a idler asked timidly, "Maybe you really haven't heard of him?" Kun Yongzi rolled his eyes at him. "He's a little demon. He offended the Dragon King, how can he spare him? He's a Taoist, how can I not hear of him? This 1,000-mile Dongting is the dragon palace of the Wei River Dragon King. Which demon dares to call himself the Lord Dongting?" Hearing what he said, everyone was impressed. He said it loudly, so Du Xing in the courtyard also heard it. He was sitting with his eyes closed, but now he opened his eyes slowly with a strange smile on his face. He shook his head. "Taoist, you're not good at learning, so you'd better talk less. When the Lord Dongting comes to report to me tonight and hears what you said, he." After that he closed his eyes again. Kun Yongzi didn't argue with him but just snorted coldly. After they finished talking, a gust of night wind blew. The onlookers gradually stopped talking. Since they came to see, they would always think, "Is it true?" Kun Yongzi said something about the Dragon King and the demon, but it indirectly made people think more. When the night was getting late, the weather became cold and the night wind blew again. Looking at the faint candles in the courtyard, people became silent for a while. Just at this moment they heard a clear and pleasant male voice. "In fact, I suggest you go home to wash up and sleep." This voice broke the brief silence, and people forgot to look at the source of the voice. They found it was a handsome scholar in a white robe. At a glance people knew he was a foreigner. Because if he was a local or had been wandering here for some days, he would remember him. Because he was so good-looking. This good-looking young man was holding a folding fan made of bamboo ribs. As he spoke, he squinted slightly and looked to the west. The street in front of Du Xing's house did lead to the west. There was a ferry there, but few people used it. Beside the street was a grassland. Looking along the road, people could vaguely see reeds and calamus swaying in the night wind by the water in the bright moonlight. He was looking there. People followed his line of sight for a while but found nothing. Except reeds, calamus, mist and wind, there was nothing. Kun Yongzi stared at Li Yunxin for a while and frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Li Yunxin didn't reply to him immediately. Instead she took 2 steps forward and looked at them carefully for a while. Then she turned her head and smiled. "What I mean is, everyone, if you don't leave now you will die." Hearing his words at this time and in this kind of environment, people were stunned. Kun Yongzi's expression changed and he shouted, "What kind of crazy words are you talking about?" But his expression, tone, and behavior didn't seem like a crazy person. This made people unhappy. People on the street started to shout, "What kind of unlucky words are you, young man? How can your mouth be so poisonous?" And some more unpleasant words. But soon, another gust of wind blew. This gust of wind was strange. It blew along the ground, slowly along the street, sweeping up a few pieces of leaves on the street, but the weeds on the side of the street didn't move at all. Seeing this strange scene, people suddenly fell silent. But suddenly they heard Du Ziwei, who was sitting in the courtyard, suddenly open his eyes. As if he was possessed, he waved his hands and shouted 3 times, "Good, good, good." He knelt down again and didn't say anything. Chapter 120. No matter how he looked at it, Zhou Xian did not look like an ordinary person. The people on the street finally felt a little scared. Someone asked Kun Yangzi, "What should we do, Taoist?" Kun Yangzi seemed to be a little flustered. He took out a talisman and stuck it on his face. He looked around like a restrained zombie. After a while he carefully removed the talisman and said, "There are no ghosts here. It's okay." He seemed to feel that he had lost his composure. He glared at Li Yunxin and said, "You're so young and you're trying to be mysterious." Looking at their shocked and dumbfounded expressions, Li Yunxin just smiled and looked away. However, he was no longer looking to the west. Instead, he was looking at the courtyard of Du Sheng's house. He looked at Du Sheng first and then his eyes followed something outside. He passed through the crowd and stopped in front of them. It was almost as if he was acting. In such a time and place, his behavior was infuriating and infuriating. They had never seen such a scary person. Was he deliberately doing it in front of others? But looking at his demeanor, he did not seem to be a villager. They wanted to rush up and beat him away. However, if he was a famous scholar who did not kneel before officials, they would probably have to go to jail for a few days if they beat him up and reported him to the authorities. Therefore they could criticize him. This was what these people were best at. But even so, they were still anxious and hoped that he would say something. After a quarter of an hour, as they wished, the young man spoke. He looked at the empty space in front of him and smiled. "That's not it. If there is no one, where will we get the offerings?" His eerie and senseless words silenced them again. Kun Yangzi frowned. Then he saw Li Yunxin turn his face towards them and sighed, "It's rare for me to be kind. I thought that you might be the source of incense offerings in the future, so I gave you a reminder." "What happened in the end?" "I said something and you talked about me for so long. Why did I come?" "There's no need to look. It's too late. You won't live past tonight." Li Yunxin waved his hand. "Go see Du Ziwei yourself. Haven't you heard of a ghost marriage?" Everyone was speechless. Because he didn't feel any discomfort and the moon was bright, so why? Only Kun Yangzi's eyes widened when he heard this. He immediately turned around and kicked open the fence gate, running straight to Du Sheng's side. She reached out and slapped him hard on the shoulder. Du Sheng fell to the ground with a thud. The people on the street cried out in alarm. Kun Yangzi reached out his trembling hand to check his breath. He had been dead for a long time. Kun Yangzi immediately sat on the ground. After staring at Du Sheng's corpse for a while, he suddenly turned to glare at Li Yunxin. "Why didn't you say so earlier? How many lives have you taken from us?" Seeing that the Taoist priest suddenly lost his composure, everyone knew that something terrible had happened. But for a moment they were confused. They didn't know if they should leave or ask the Taoist priest or the young man for help. The Taoist priest gritted his teeth and stood up. The yellow crown on his head fell off. He wrapped himself in his cloak and rushed out of the fence gate, running straight to Li Yunxin. He raised his hand as if he was going to hit him. He shouted, "Why did you take our lives? Why didn't you say so earlier?" This Kun Yangzi was strong. Now that he was panicking, he gave off a strong aura. But before his strong arm could touch Li Yunxin's shoulder, Li Yunxin had already raised his hand and slapped him to the ground. This slap was so strong that the crisp sound could be heard far in the night. Kun Yangzi was whipped so hard that he flipped in midair and fell to the ground. How could they expect this handsome young man to be so fierce? They didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Li Yunxin stared at Kun Yangzi on the ground for a while before saying, "Have you calmed down?" Kun Yangzi shook his head as he fumbled for something, trying to stand up. Finally, he climbed onto Li Yunxin's calf, but Li Yunxin didn't kick him away. The Taoist priest grabbed his leg and propped up his upper body. He looked up at Li Yunxin for a while before saying, "Save, Master, save me. I was wrong." Li Yunxin still looked at him. "What's wrong?" The Taoist priest had suffered an internal injury from that heavy blow on his head. His mouth and nose started to bleed, which was quite frightening in the night. But he still managed to hold on to his last breath. "I learned. Dao. I should know that nothing can be forced. Master has already spoken. I cannot force Master." At this point, the Taoist priest's mouth and nose started to bleed even more rapidly, blocking his throat. He could only make a ho-ho sound. Li Yunxin nodded with satisfaction. "You see, this is indeed the case. It's not like everyone in the world is your mother. Then he squatted down and put one hand on the Taoist priest's head, asking, You ran into a ghost marriage, so you won't have long to live. But since you met me and had a predestined relationship with me before you died, I can't just sit and watch you become a wandering ghost. He used a little more force to bring the Taoist priest's face closer to him, asking, Then let me ask you, do you wish to live forever? The Taoist priest's vision started to blur. Li Yunxin's voice also sounded faintly discernible in his ears. But this kind of voice sounded like the sound of nature. He blinked his eyes with difficulty and mumbled, Yes, yes, yes. Li Yunxin said again, Then you have to do something for me. The Taoist priest couldn't speak anymore, so he could only blink his eyes slightly to show his agreement. Li Yunxin reached out his hand, pulled out a hair from his temple and put it into the Taoist priest's mouth. Then he gently knocked the Taoist priest's head with his index finger. The power penetrated his skull and stirred the Taoist priest's brain into a ball of paste. He died. Then his soul stood up from the corpse in a daze. Then he saw what Li Yunxin saw just now. It turned out that in front of the Du family along the street to the west, all the way to the Dongting Lake, it was not empty in their eyes. It was full of people. It looked like people. On the small streets, in the wilderness, among the reeds and calamus trees by the water's edge, there were hundreds of people standing densely together. But their faces didn't look like humans. Some of them had gray faces. But their noses were just sharp thorns. 2 round eyes protruded out of their faces like trembling black fruits. They hunched their backs and didn't move. Occasionally they suddenly, quickly and nervously rolled their 2 eyeballs. There was also a strong man with a broad body wearing a blue armor. His face was also gray like a dead person. He didn't even have a nose. There were barbs on his arms and black beards, and he also looked like a statue. Occasionally he shook his body. The hundreds of freaks that covered the mountains and plains stood there silently as if they were ghosts. And a woman in a red dress was standing in front of Li Yunxin, curiously looking at the soul of Xianxia, and then at Li Yunxin. She asked in a shrill voice, Which spirit are you? Chapter 121. The woman was quite beautiful. Even though she couldn't be compared to Lu Ling's dazzling beauty, and she didn't have Bai Yunxin's tranquil aura. Of course this was just looks. She could still be considered a top-notch beauty. She wore a big red dress with palace gauze, and the ornaments on her hair were mainly shellfish and hawksbill turtles. She looked to be about 16 or 17 years old and her eyes were clear. She seemed to be a pure and innocent girl. But this girl, who looked out of place in the surrounding environment and people, was the main character of the night. A quarter of an hour ago, Li Yunxin saw something coming ashore from the lake. The 2 at the front were the green-gray-faced, muscular man with a broad face and wearing armor. They walked out of the misty water vapor and their eyes looked left and right as if they were very vigilant. Then 2 rows of strange people with arched backs and sharp noses climbed out of the water. They followed closely behind the strong men in armor like soldiers in a line. After they came out of the water, they were silent and only walked with stiff steps as if they were performing a funny pantomime. Mortals could not see them. When these people came ashore and stood still in the weeds, they heard the sound. 2 chubby, soft-fleshed women came out of the water, each holding a mud conch instrument, which made a strange and ear-piercing sound, which mortals could not hear. Then a young maid in a white dress supported the one in front of Li Yunxin, and they walked along the street toward Du Sheng's courtyard. Behind this woman in red was an old man, who indeed looked like a human, but also had a hunched back and wore a lake green silk robe. When they arrived outside Du Sheng's courtyard, the woman in red and the maid stopped, and the old man went straight through the bamboo fence and walked in front of Du Sheng. At that time, Du Sheng was still sitting with his eyes closed. The old man first inhaled the incense on the table, then opened his mouth and took a few bites of the pig's head, the sheep's head and the white chicken. Mortals couldn't see what was wrong with the 3 animals, but Li Yunxin knew that it was enjoying them. Then he reached out and tapped Du Sheng's head thrice. Du Ziwei's soul stood up. The hunchbacked old man smiled and bowed to him, saying, Young Master Du is a great benefactor to our family's Hong Yang, so the Lord Dongting ordered me to come and thank you. However, my Hong Yang has been together with young Master for a long time, and they have had intimate contact. Moreover, she admires young master's noble character and wishes to marry young master. Young master, you can look outside the courtyard. If you are also interested in my Hong Yang, why don't you help her achieve her goal? Meanwhile, Du Xing was completely unaware that his soul had left his body and was looking out of the courtyard. He saw that the woman in red was looking at him. Her bright eyes and white teeth made her look even more charming in the night. This scholar had tasted the pleasures of men and women when he was young, but when had he ever seen such a beauty? He hastily said, Xiaoxing has cultivated 3 lifetimes of good fortune to meet Hong Yang. How can I dare to decline? Good. After saying this, he proudly looked at Xianxia and the people on the street. But how could those people see a soul? Du Xing was about to stir up trouble again when the old man said, If that's the case, quickly follow me to the Whitewood Forest's Red Flower City. The Lord Dongting is waiting for young master to feast. After saying this, he used his hand to pull Du Ziwei. As soon as he pulled, Du Ziwei became silly again as if he had lost his mind, and finally left his body. It was also at this time that Li Yunxin said a few words to those people, but he was ridiculed and ridiculed. The old man led Du Ziwei's soul out of the courtyard and saw the people on the street. His pair of old eyes immediately turned into crescent moons and he repeatedly said, Good. Since it's Hong Yang's big day, let's invite these fellow villagers to congratulate her. Capturing Hong Yang from the lake and enduring the wind, sun, and salt to get married was not in vain. After saying this, those mutants who were originally standing in the weeds came over and began to pull those idle men and women. Li Yunxin saw it clearly. As soon as those people moved, they pulled the souls out of their bodies as if they were holding a child or a chicken or a duck effortlessly. There was also a strange person who walked to Li Yunxin's side and reached out to pull him. But the woman in red had already seen him and waved her hand to order the strange person to step back. She walked back and forth in front of Li Yunxin a few steps, then asked, I see that you are not a mortal. Why did you remind them to run away? Do you love these mortals and want to be a human? Li Yunxin answered. Not really. If there are no people, where will we get offerings? Hearing this, the woman in red seemed to have developed an interest in him that far surpassed that of Du Xing. She asked again, But they don't seem to understand your good intentions. What are you going to do? Thus, Li Yunxin turned around and killed Xianxia with a palm strike. At this time, although the mortals on the street were still standing, their souls had already left their bodies. Li Yunxin knew that if those strange people took their souls away, those people would die a violent death. The cause of death was unknown. The woman in red stood quietly watching him do all that and listening to him speak. She asked, Which spirit are you? Only then did Li Yunxin smile and say, Me? As for me, I was originally a human. Later on, I was beaten to death and became what I am today, a ghost cultivator. The woman tilted her head and looked at him, her interest growing. Why were you beaten to death? Why weren't you taken away by the king of hell? Because when I was alive, I liked to eat human flesh. Li Yunxin shrugged. After killing too many people, I became a demon. When the relatives and friends of those I ate found me, they killed me. Because my killing intent was too strong, I could not enter the cycle of reincarnation. That was why I cultivated the ghost path and became a Yin spirit. The girl blinked in surprise as if she found this very strange. The maidservant beside her had been waiting quietly. But now she looked at the moon and said softly, Hong Yang, it's getting late. The girl ignored her and stared at Li Yunxin. She thought for a while and asked again, You were a human when you were alive, why did you eat humans? At this time the maidservant pulled her sleeve again. This Hong Yang did not even look at her. With a flick of her sleeve, the maidservant was sent flying more than 10 steps away. With a loud bang, the maidservant hit the bamboo fence of Du Sheng's house. Then, as if ordering a servant to serve a cup of tea, she said, Dissect her for me. Li Yunxin did not see the maidservant's expression clearly. He only saw the hunchbacked old man in a green robe slowly walking over. He took out a small knife from somewhere and waved it at the maidservant on the ground. The pretty young lady disappeared. Only a big white carp with its stomach cut open was left on the ground. It swung its tail a few times, causing dust to fly up, and then it stopped moving. But he only smiled at the Hong Yang and said, The cloud has no heart, the water is leisurely. Who asked me to not have a heart in my previous life? At that time I did not know anything about etiquette and morality. I only felt that eating humans was no different from eating chickens and ducks. When the girl heard this, her eyes brightened. What about now? Li Yunqing was silent for a while. He smiled and shook his head. In this life now, do you think I still have a heart? The girl tilted her head and thought for a while. Then she looked up at the moon. Suddenly, her expression changed and she covered her mouth. Ah, it's getting late. That white carp was right. My father is getting impatient. After saying this, she did not leave. Instead, she looked at Li Yunqing reluctantly. She only felt that what this person did and said just now, for some reason, was in line with her heart. It was as if this person knew everything she thought and liked. Hong Yang looked at the soul of Kun Yangzi, who was standing next to him, and pointed at it. What do you want him to do for you? Li Yunqing was still smiling kindly. His smile was gentle and sincere. Under the moonlight, it was strangely attractive. Seeing that Hong Yang is so happy, I don't have any gifts to give. So, I used a method to take the soul of this Taoist priest. I used a strand of my hair to transfer some spiritual power to him. His soul is more clever than those ordinary people. I gave it to Hong Yang as a servant. It can be considered as fulfilling his wish to live a long life. Hong Yang seemed to be very happy after hearing this. She jumped up, clapped her hands and said, Good, 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 I accept your gift. You are good-looking and interesting. Let me tell you, I am the new Dragon King of the Sanhika Dragon King Temple. If you want to see me, go there and call me. Maybe I will see you. Hey, I'm leaving. You are not allowed to leave. I still want to play with you in the future. If you dare to leave, I will ask someone to cut you open. After saying this, Hong Yang turned around and left. It seemed that she was really afraid that the Lord Dongting would be anxious. It only took a few seconds for the two of them to talk. At this time, the people on the street saw that Li Yunqing killed the Taoist priest. They all widened their eyes in fear and wanted to run away. But soon they found that they could not move, as if they were controlled by something. When they finished talking, Red Madam turned around and left. The mutants who were with the mortals also escorted their ghosts away. Therefore, there was a series of crashing sounds. These 40 people fell to the ground one by one. They were all dead. The night was eerily silent. Li Yunqing was still standing under the tree, watching the mutants all over the mountain return to the water. The night became cold again. Then he slowly patted the bamboo fan in his hand, walked through the corpses on the street and slowly walked along the road. What on earth was the Lord Dongting? Although he had been near the city of Wei for less than 2 months, it was normal that he did not know about the big demons nearby. However, the Lord Dongting. Was he in the waters under the jurisdiction of the 9th young master? This Hong Yang was undoubtedly the daughter of the Lord Dongting, who was pickled like a salted fish. Her manner was even grander than that of the 9th young master. What kind of person was the Lord Dongting? Such a person in the Wei River, in the Dongting Lake, the arrogant big demon, the 9th young master never mentioned him. He seemed to be a big guy. Li Yunqing knocked on his palm with the folding fan and stopped walking. Suddenly he laughed happily. His daughter dared to occupy the temple of the Dragon King, but no other Yin spirit caused trouble. A few days ago he tried to find the translucent jade slip left by the 9th young master, but he could not find it. Maybe it was related to the Lord Dongting. He seemed to be very strong. But he was not sure if he was strong enough to take the blame of Bai Yunqing. Chapter 122. There were more than 100 families in Egret town and about 500 people. More than 40 people died in one night. Since they were all related to each other, the whole town was in mourning during the day. In normal times, this would definitely be a big case that would shock the prefecture government. But at this critical juncture, who would have the time to care? Magistrate Zhao was planning to go north, and the 3 magistrates were also busy dealing with the disaster in Weiqing. After all, such a big thing happened in one's jurisdiction and the future was bleak. So on the 3rd day, only 1 constable came from Weiqing with 3 officials. They first talked to the clan elder and the bodyguard. After that, they just treated it as a natural disaster. Don't make trouble again. Otherwise, the officials in the city would be worried, and they might arrest all of you and interrogate you for money and murder. This act of scaring, then there would be no way to cry and complain. At this time, people remembered the miraculous event that Du Ziwei mentioned. So the 3 words Lord Dongting became the most frequently used words in Egret town. This was the result that Li Yunqing wanted. If there was really a person called Lord Dongting, and he was a powerful low-key demon, then people in Egret town would definitely know about him. Maybe they didn't know what Lord Dongting was, but someone must have heard of him or directly or indirectly contacted him. Now that something like this had happened, people would start talking about him, and a lot of old things might be dug up. Li Yunxin was very sure of this, because he was also looking for the temporary imperial residence of the 9th young master. He already had some understanding of the temporary imperial residence. So he knew that the 9th young master took Lu Ling's ancient book of Luo and the feather robe into his temporary imperial residence. But he might not have brought the temporary imperial residence with him, and it should be somewhere else. Li Yunxin had the reverse scale of the 9th young master, so he followed the aura and went to the place where the temporary imperial residence was supposed to be. It was gone. Someone had taken the palace before him. He didn't have a clue before, but now he realized that the most likely person was the Lord Dongting. The book of Luo and Yui were fine, but there was still the translucent jade scroll. Someone actually wanted to take advantage of him. This was simply outrageous. Therefore, after successfully bringing up the topic, Li Yunxin spent the next few days walking around the town, listening to the people talking about the Lord Dongting. Right now he was sitting in a tea house savoring a cup of tea. It was afternoon and the sun was shining brightly. The weather was neither hot nor cold, and the warm breeze carried the fragrance of flowers and plants. He sat at a table by the window and looked out at the bluestone street sprinkled with mottled shadows of trees and sunlight. Looking to the west, you can see the white light on the horizon. That is Dongting under the sun. Tier's bamboo fan was placed on the table. Steam was rising from the half cup of tea. He heard a few people at the neighboring table talking about the Lord Dongting. However, it was obvious that he was talking nonsense. Many things were illogical and common sense, and they were speculating about demons with human thinking. Many people swore that they had heard about the Lord Dongting or someone close to them had heard about the Lord Dongting. However, once they asked carefully, they found that my friend and my relative were completely untrue. Li Yunxin was a little annoyed, so he planned to get up and eat something. In fact, he was eating now because he was greedy. His body was his spirit, and it could be strengthened by the power of wish. Although he could touch it, he could also pass through the wall like a ghost as long as he thought about it. However, it didn't feel good. However, there was no Munan restaurant in this town, and the food was not to his taste. Therefore, he stood up and hesitated for a while, thinking about whether he should use his supernatural power to find a restaurant in the city of Wei. In ancient times, Liang traveled to Europe to feed pigeons. Today, Dragon King Li traveled to the city of Wei to have a sumptuous meal. It was also a good story. However, at this moment of hesitation, his ears keenly captured a voice in another corner of the tea house. After this, it's not good to go to Taoist Li's banquet. After all, there are things to take care of at home. It's hard to say. It's said that he has a new beautiful concubine. It's hard to refuse, I'm afraid he. There was nothing unusual about these words, but the voice was lowered. It was this detail that made Li Yunxin turn his head subconsciously and look at the person who spoke. With just one glance, he realized that something was going on. The three men who spoke were in their 40s or 50s and seemed to be from wealthy families. Considering the population and economic situation of this town, they should be the heads of families or have their own business. Generally speaking, they were the middle class and the elite of this town. There was nothing unusual about these three old men gathering together to brag or discuss some matters. However, many details told Li Yunxin that they were a little nervous. It was not because of the surrounding environment that brought them pressure, but because of what they were discussing. The fine wrinkles at the corner of their eyes, the corners of their mouth, and the Adam's apple all told Li Yunxin this conclusion. What he was talking about was something that they were looking forward to and excited, but it also made them feel ashamed and uneasy. And he mentioned the words, Taoist Li. Li Yunxin sat down again and quietly picked up the half cup of tea. She quietly pricked up her ears to listen. After an hour, the three people left the tea house. Li Yunxin stood up and also followed them out of the door with his folding fan. The people on the street all looked distressed, and the three people walked out in a hurry. They walked along the long street for a while and went straight west. Li Yunxin was more and more sure that he followed the right people. They were walking in the direction of Du Sheng's house. More than 40 people died there, and people said that the murderous aura was too strong and it was too late to avoid it. But the three people didn't care. It seemed that they were going to the ferry over there. They boarded the boat from the ferry and traveled on the water for an hour. Then they arrived at Mount June. He followed the three people out of the long street, and when there was no one around, Li Yunxin shook his body, turning into a middle-aged scholar with a long beard. He had a handsome face and wore a white brocade robe. After a few steps, one of the three people turned around and saw him. So he stopped and didn't go. When Li Yunxin slowly walked over, he stopped him and politely asked, "Friend, you look unfamiliar. Where are you from and where are you going?" The speaker seemed to be the backbone of the three. Li Yunxin had confirmed this in the tea house. He was a slightly chubby middle-aged man and his family ran a hotel. He was called Shopkeeper Ding. Li Yunxin blinked and looked surprised. "I'm from the Tang of the East and I'm going to Mount June in the West." "Can't you go there?" Shopkeeper Ding exchanged glances with the other two people and said, "The Tang of the East? I've never heard of this place." He thought for a moment and then said, "Friend, why are you going to Mount June?" "Sightseeing." Li Yunxin said, "I travel all the way in the world just to collect anecdotes so that I can write a novel. I heard that the 1,000-mile Dongting is a magnificent scenery in the southeast, and Mount June is also one of the 8 sceneries in Dongting." Speaking of this, Shopkeeper Ding hurriedly interrupted him, "Do you really have a lot of anecdotes?" Li Yunxin opened his eyes wide in confusion. Of course." Shopkeeper Ding was overjoyed and he clapped his hands and laughed. "Good. Since you come to Mount June for sightseeing, we can also be regarded as half a host. Let me introduce you to a first-class romantic figure, how about it?" Li Yunxin laughed in his heart. If it's a romantic figure, then I'd like to meet him. How dare I disobey?" Seeing his forthright behavior, the three people were even happier. They immediately took his hand enthusiastically and led him all the way to the ferry. Chapter 123. When they arrive at the ferry, it turns out that a boat has been waiting for them. A man wearing a water suit and a bamboo hat stands at the bow of the boat. He has no oar or pole in his hand and doesn't speak. Seeing the 4 people coming, he looks up and points at Li Yunxin. It seems that he is asking why there is one more person. The man seems to be very pale. His face is blue as if he is seriously ill. He has a long and thin face with sharp edges. He always looks a little familiar. Shopkeeper Ding smiles and bows to him, saying, "I met a wonderful man on the way. He has some strange stories. I'm going to introduce him to your Taoist." The man stops asking and gets out of the way from the bow. The 3 people get on the boat easily. The boat sinks slightly and makes a circle of ripples on the water. Li Yunxin looks at the boat and the vast Dongting Lake. He hesitates for a moment and then gets on the boat. Then there is a splash. The man jumps into the water. He is in the water. His body is bending and his legs are kicking fast. He is actually swimming in the water and pushing the boat. Shopkeeper Ding laughs. This young man has a weird temper and is not easy to talk to. "Well, what's your name?" "I'm Li Xuanhuan." The boat is sailing on Dongting and the sun is gradually tilting to the west. The blazing sun becomes soft and dim. The sparkling waves on the lake are really like fish scales. It is the first time for Li Yunxin to see such clear water. Not far from the shore, he can even see the water grass at the bottom of the lake. However, the boat gradually goes deep into the water and becomes a piece of deep jade. In the distance, he can see Mount June. Mount June is actually an island with a lonely peak on the island. Looking from here, the island was covered in emerald green vegetation. A beautiful and tall mountain peak rose steeply from the island, with clouds and mist lingering around it. It was truly a heaven-defying creation. It seems that it will take a long time to get to Mount June. Li Yunxin chats with the 3 people. He has learned most of the things from their conversation in the tea house. It is said that there is a hermit Taoist Li on Mount June. This Taoist Li is an extraordinary person. Perhaps it was a descendant of a wealthy merchant who was disillusioned with worldly affairs and brought his wealth to Mount June to build the School of the Emperor Star. The School of the Emperor Star was built against the mountain. It was divided into the front, middle, and back halls. The front hall was built at the foot of the mountain, the middle hall was built halfway up the mountain, and the back hall was built in the clouds at the top of the mountain. The 3 halls were connected by a wooden walkway, and the walkway was suspended in mid-air. According to shopkeeper Ding, he had once walked along the plank path to the middle hall. Standing in the middle of the clouds on the mountainside, the soles of your feet hanging in the air. The surrounding vegetation was verdant, and there was a vast expanse of mist in the distance. I felt like I was in a fairyland. As for Taoist priest Li, at the end of every month he would invite the local scholars to the school of the Emperor Star. He had only one hobby: listening to stories. He invited them to the front hall, served them refreshments and tea, and invited them to tell stories. If he heard a novel or interesting story, he would ask that person to point out 3 more friends to go with him to the middle hall. According to shopkeeper Ding, there were delicacies that could make people swallow their tongues, as well as other wonderful things. Li Yunxin knew about these things. She was scheming and had an ulterior motive, so she started to lead the 3 of them to talk. He instinctively felt that this Taoist priest Li might be related to the Lord Dongting in some way. How could such a strange person who had created such a scene on Mount June? How could he not be related to the Lord Dongting? Perhaps this was a breakthrough. The 4 people chatted and gradually became familiar with each other. The other 2 people who had been quiet also became interested. The dark-faced, thin and tall one was called Officer Zhao, and the chubby one was called Officer Sunday. Li Yunxin sat firmly on the side of the boat and asked, "Is there a story behind the name Mount June?" Officer Sun casually said, "Ah, it's because of the Lord Dongting. I heard people talking about the Lord Dongting in the town these days. Is there such a story?" Li Yunxin's heart skipped a beat, but he still asked with interest, "Does Brother Sun know the story?" Officer Sun hesitated for a while and shook his head. "I'm not afraid that you will laugh at me. This is a story passed down in my family. I don't usually talk about it, but today I hit it off with you." Shopkeeper Ding and Officer Zhao were also surprised and said, "Old Sun, I didn't hear you talk about this usually. What story do you have here?" Officer Sun smiled bitterly. "Well, it's nothing special. I just heard about it. When I was a child, I heard from my elders that there was no Dragon King in Wei River and Dongting Lake. Now we are in the Daqing State dynasty. Which dynasty was it, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago? Well, it was none of them. At that time we were called Nan's 100 Kingdoms. Then a deity appeared in Dongting Lake. He was called Lord Dongting. He helped the monarch of Wei Kingdom to pacify the Nan's Lake. Gradually, the territory of the Daqing State came into being. At that time it was said that Lord Dongting lived on Mount June. This mountain got its name from him. But now, after so many years, we have Dragon King in Wei River. Who still remembers Lord Dongting? You can go home and ask your elders. Maybe they also know about this." Hearing this, shopkeeper Ding frowned and thought for a while. Then he clapped his hands. "That's right. I really remember him. I knew the name was familiar. Didn't it mean that the Dragon King showed his divinity in the city of Wei a few days ago?" Officer Zhao blinked. "Did the Dragon King move to another place, and Lord Dongting showed up again? What did the boy named Du say again? That Lord Dongting wanted to repay his kindness?" Officer Sun hurriedly said, "Bah. Don't talk about Dragon King in Dongting Lake." Officer Zhao patted his head. "Yes. Oh, Dragon King, don't blame me. I didn't mean it." But they didn't know that Dragon King Li of Wei River was sitting next to them. Hearing this, Li Yunxin knew that this trip must be fruitful. Mount June got its name because of Lord Dongting. Taoist Li also built the school of the Emperor Star on Mount June. There must be some connection. But he didn't think it was a coincidence. In his opinion, except for extremely accidental and isolated events, all coincidences and accidents must have a reason. For example, Officer Sun happened to know the story of Mount June. It was also because he stayed in Egret Island for a long time and deliberately chose the 3 people who were most likely to know the secret. This was not a coincidence. He was now walking in the capital of Li Kingdom, but Officer Sun just happened to pester him and talk about the story of Mount June. This was a coincidence. After chatting for a while, the boat arrived at the dock of Mount June. From afar they saw a servant waiting at the dock. When the boat docked, the white and soft servant didn't say anything. He just smiled and bowed, leading the 4 people forward. The 3 of them were not surprised, but Li Yunxin deliberately looked at him a few times and then smiled slightly. In front of the dock, there was a stone path leading to the forest in the distance along the snow-white beach. In the forest they saw a stone gate archway with 2 leaping stone fish carved on it. There were stone lions guarding on both sides. On the archway there were 3 ancient characters. School of the Emperor Star. Li Yunxin looked at the gate from afar and made a sound of surprise. He knew that tonight would probably be interesting. The sun was about to set. The sunlight stretched the shadows of the people who had been waiting in front of the gate and cast them on the stone ground. One of them looked anxious. Li Yunxin recognized him. He was the emptiness state cultivator of the Pill Cauldron sect in the city of Wei, Zhou Xian. Note 1. Diving suit, a one-piece diving suit made from shark skin by the ancients. The surface is smooth and warm. Chapter 124. When he got closer he saw that Zhou Xian had his hands behind his back and was talking to a servant. Wait. Do you know the relationship between me and your master? If you dare stop me again I will kill you on the spot. But the servant only smiled and didn't say anything, as if he didn't know fear. He just blocked the door and didn't let him go. Shopkeeper Ding didn't know Zhou Xian, but he was a sociable person. He walked over and cupped his hands towards Zhou Xian, smiling. Friend, don't be impatient. Daoist Li has some rules here. Since you were invited here you must be an interesting person. Why argue with a child? I think we should. Zhou Xian glanced at him coldly. Scram. Who do you think you are? After saying this, he waved his sleeves and the servant flew back 4 or 5 steps, falling to the ground and unable to get up. Then Zhou Xian took a big step forward and walked towards the door. Everyone looked at each other in dismay. Shopkeeper Ding was so angry that his face turned red. He stammered, this person. Li Yunxin patted his shoulder and added fuel to the fire. Don't be angry. Didn't you see that he was wearing a Taoist robe? He was also a cultivator of immortality. What if he killed us? Shopkeeper Ding panted and stared at Zhou Xian's back. Bah. This kind of person doesn't deserve to cultivate. How does Taoist Li have such a friend? Although angry, the 10 people outside followed Zhou Xian into the door. Only Li Yunxin was walking behind. When she passed by the manservant she grabbed him and pulled him up. The servant was still smiling when he fell to the ground. He stood up with blood dripping from the corner of his mouth, but the smile on his face didn't change. Li Yunxin also smiled at him and followed the others. Behind them the sun disappeared west of the mountains and night fell. Behind the door was a stone road. There were small stone street lamps on the side of the road. They were about half a person's height and there was one every 10 steps. They didn't know how, but when people passed by the lamps would light up. Although they had seen it a few times they were still amazed. On both sides of the street light was a meadow, and behind the meadow were rockery, flowers and trees that reached the sky. The front yard was quite spacious, reminding Li Yunxin of the garden in front of a European-style castle. The end of the road was brightly lit. Li Yunxin looked through the gaps in the crowd and saw the front hall. The front hall was built in an antique style, and the materials used were mainly original colored wood. The 8 doors of the hall were wide open. Behind the door was a spacious hall with a wooden floor and a short table. It was very similar to the second floor of the Qianghua building. His eyesight was good, so he saw a person sitting in the main seat of the hall facing south. He gently stroked his beard with 2 fingers and smiled at the crowd. This must be Taoist Li. Looking at his face, Li Yunxin could only tell that he was a handsome middle-aged man, but he couldn't tell his age. His smile was kind, but there was a hint of majesty to it. She wore an apricot yellow Taoist robe and had her hair combed into a bun. There was a jade hairpin in her hair. There was nothing special about her attire. At this time, Zhou Xian strode to the front of the hall and went straight into the hall saying, "Brother Li, there's trouble." Li Yunxin slightly raised his eyebrows. He thought that Zhou Xian was just joking when he said he was friends with Taoist Li. He didn't expect that the arrogant Taoist Li would really treat this secular Taoist as a true friend. He even thought that Taoist Li was superior to him. This Taoist Li seemed to have some skills. At least the street lights that lit up just now weren't something that a rogue Taoist could easily learn. Taoist Li was not surprised at all after hearing Zhou Xian's words. He still smiled and put down his hand saying, "Brother, why are you so alarmed? What trouble is it?" His voice was very pleasant to hear. But he spoke very slowly. Every sentence was slow and unhurried. When it entered the ears of the listeners, It made them feel as if their whole body had lost all strength. They just wanted to sit quietly and listen. At this time, Zhou Xian displayed the bearing that a cultivator should have. He didn't put the mortals behind him in his eyes. He looked at the table in the hall, then at Daoist Li, who was sitting in a dangerous position. He seemed to be used to this and knew that he couldn't do anything about it. Thus, after a moment of hesitation, he sighed and walked to a table, then knelt down and said, "Brother Li, that fairy Ling Kong's Dharma body is gone. The people from the heavenly abode will probably come in a few days. How can I explain it to them?" Fairy Dharma body. When these two words entered everyone's ears, they were all stunned. Although they didn't know the inside story of what happened a few days ago, they had heard rumors about the battle between the immortals, the Dragon King, and the demons. Now that they heard these words, 3 of them stopped in their tracks. After a moment of hesitation, they nervously smiled and cupped their hands toward Daoist Li, saying, "Daoist, since you have an urgent matter, we won't disturb you tonight." Daoist Li still had a smile on his face. He nodded slightly and said slowly, "Good, good, good. Go, go, go." The 3 people hurriedly turned around and wanted to leave. Zhou Xian glared at them and shouted, "Don't seek death." The 3 people trembled and said, "Yes, yes, yes." They hurriedly ran away. The remaining 6 people, including Li Yunxin, didn't know whether to advance or retreat. These people probably didn't know the seriousness of the matter. They weren't very quick-witted. They also coveted Daoist Li's feast. They really loved the pleasure of their stomachs and bodies. At this moment of hesitation, Daoist Li smiled again. "Friends, why don't you sit down? It's not a big deal. It's just a small problem." Zhou Xian became anxious. "Brother Li, it's not a small matter." Daoist Li raised his hand to interrupt him, smiled and said slowly, "I have my ways. Don't worry. First, let's get down to business. Come, my friends, take your seats. Oh dear. I have a new friend." Hearing their master say this, the 5 people slightly calmed down. Without looking at Zhou Xian, they each picked a seat and sat down. Once Li Yunxin was seated, shopkeeper Ding said, "I'll let Taoist Zhang know that we met this Brother Li by chance on the road. Brother Li came from the Tang dynasty of the East, traveling all over the world to see the beautiful scenery and collect anecdotes. I heard that Daoist Li happened to be in the same place, so I came along." Zhou Xian, who was full of anxiety, lost the coldness and reservation of a cultivator today. Or to some extent he slightly approved of these people who were in the same room as him in front of Daoist Li. He sneered, "What kind of place is the Tang dynasty of the East? I've never heard of it." But Li Yunxin didn't care about him at all. He was thinking about what this unlucky Zhou Xian had said just now while observing Daoist Li. This Daoist Li was very strange. He was too calm and collected. This made Li Yunxin think of some people who had overhauled their faces. He was smiling, but there was almost no subtle change in his expression. It was as if his face was stiff like a mask. Daoist Li turned to Li Yunxin with a smile and went straight to the point. "My friend, what story did you tell me? If your story is pleasant to listen to, then I will be blessed tonight." He slowly raised his hand and pointed to the mountain behind him. "I've prepared delicious food and beautiful women in the middle hall. If I like your story, the 4 of you can go up the mountain." Zhou Xian seemed to really believe that this Daoist Li had a supernatural power that could solve his problem. He temporarily suppressed his temper, took a breath, and returned to the way he was when Li Yunxin first met him, sitting next to the prefectural magistrate Li Yaoxi with his eyes slightly closed without sadness or joy. As for whether or not he was truly emotionless, only he himself would know. So Li Yunxin smiled and said, "Daoist Li, please. I happen to have a story that will amuse you, Daoist. This story is called Little Dragon's Son Looking for Mother." Chapter 125. Hearing this name, everyone was a little surprised. Li Daozhang was still smiling and didn't blink. "Oh? Then tell us." Zhou Xian looked up at Li Yunxin and sneered, "What a shitty name." Li Yunxin could understand Zhou Xian's mood at the moment. He came to find his savior in a hurry, but he was forced to listen to a story. He couldn't vent his anger on Li Daozhang, so he could only vent his anger on them. As for whether it would embarrass the host or make the host unhappy, he probably thought about it before he started cultivating. After cultivating for a long time and being flattered by others, he probably forgot about it. He said slowly, there was a little dragon son in the pond. It had a big head and a dark gray body. It swung its long tail and swam around. He didn't pay attention to the story at all. He only replaced the little tadpole with the little dragon son, and the mother frog with the mother dragon. But he told it so vividly and intoxicatedly, shaking his head. Ding Zhao and Sun felt like they were sitting on pins and needles. Sweat beads appeared on their foreheads. They thought Li Xuanhuan was handsome and seemed to be a knowledgeable person on the boat. Why did he become like this? They wondered if there was a prize at the end of the story. If the prize was to Li Daozhang's liking, maybe he wouldn't blame them. The others thought the same as the three of them. Therefore, although Song Yunzi was frowning as he listened, he endured it and did not say anything. He only occasionally said a few mocking words like, "ha ha," or "what a joke in the world," and waited for the rest of the story. After Li Yunxin finished the last sentence, they followed their mother and spat every day. He sat there without saying anything else. The group of people stayed silent with him for a while. The few elites of society, the cultivators of a school, and the master of a palace sat in a row obediently and listened to his fairy tale carefully and quietly. Song Yunzi suddenly slammed the table and shouted, "You bastard, how dare you make fun of us?" Li Daozhang was still smiling and looking at him. Li Yunxin raised his head and looked at Song Yunzi for a while. Suddenly he smiled. "My friend, are you an idiot?" Song Yunzi's eyes widened. She looked at Li Yunxin in disbelief for a while, then looked at Li Daozhang. She then turned her gaze back and pointed at herself. "Are you talking to me?" Everyone else was stunned. It was hard to imagine that Li Yunxin would say such vulgar words in such an occasion. Li Yunxin also slammed the table and cursed, "You King didn't stop talking when I was talking just now." Li Daozhang hadn't even said anything and you jumped out to make your presence known. I hate people like you the most. You take every opportunity to act cool, but in the end you always act like a fool. He cursed repeatedly, causing everyone present to frown. Song Yunzi's expression was as if he had seen the most amazing thing in the world. He was shocked and angry and only thought about how to punish this arrogant mortal. But when Li Yunxin scolded him, he didn't even take a breath. Song Yunzi felt like he was going to die from anger. He had to think of a way to torture him. Soon he heard the next sentence. His rage reached a new high. He thought to himself, "I can't let you off so easily, I must." Then he heard something even more outrageous. For a moment he was stunned. Ever since he started cultivating, no one had ever dared to scold him like this. When Li Yunxin stopped, Song Yunzi was speechless. His eyes looked like they were going to pop out. He pointed at Li Yunxin with a trembling finger. He looked at him, then at Li Daozhang. His eyes moved back and forth between the two, but in the end he couldn't say anything. His chest was about to explode. Li Yunxin didn't look at him. He let out a long breath, picked up the cup of tea in front of him and took a sip to moisten his throat. Ding Zhao and Sun looked at him dumbfounded. Just as they were about to open their mouths to help him, they heard Li Daozhang laugh. This story is interesting. This time, Song Yunzi even forgot to tremble. He stared at Li Daozhang without saying anything. Li Daozhang smiled and waved his hand. Don't be impatient. In my opinion, he's very interesting. He's my friend, there's no need to fuss over this kind of thing. Brother Li, tell me, which 3 people are you going to bring to my hall? Li Yunxin's expression was as usual as she pointed at Ding Zhao and Sun and said, "It's these 3. At this time several people shouted, "Li Daozhang, why don't you let us tell you a story? We've been thinking hard for more than a month." At this time, Li Daozhang had already stood up and walked toward the rear courtyard. His movements were as leisurely as his words, leaving Song Yunzi in place. Ding Zhao and Sun didn't know how the situation had turned around. They sat there in a daze. Of course, they didn't know that Li Yunxin deliberately told them a story that seemed a bit stupid. They guessed that Li Daozhang probably wouldn't like it. But that didn't matter. He knew that. How could he be interesting in front of a certain kind of people? In fact, he also wanted Song Yunzi to run his mouth and give himself a reason to curse. If Song Yunzi dared to take Li Daozhang's life in front of him, then it meant that Song Yunzi didn't really care about this Li Daozhang. Then he also wouldn't be the person he was looking for. And if the situation became like this, then Li Daozhang would definitely think that he was very interesting. Because when he was telling the story, he had been observing the other party's reaction. The other party was very interested in him, far more than the others. Thus, Li Yunxin stood up, clasped his hands behind his back and slowly walked through the middle of them. When he reached Song Yunzi's side, who was still in a daze, he happily winked at him. I know you're very angry, friend. But you're also a coward who doesn't dare to do anything in front of him. Looking at you, you seem to have learned some magic. See, I don't like to play tricks the most. If you're not happy with me, let's meet in the small forest at the back of the mountain and fight, okay? Let me tell you, I obtained a mental cultivation method from a disciple of the Black Cave sect. I advise you not to ask for trouble. When he said the first half of this sentence, Song Yunzi almost couldn't control himself and wanted to punch him in the face. But after hearing the second half of the sentence, the anger on his face quickly disappeared. This emptiness realm cultivator of the Pill Cauldron sect of Xianxia finally let out a long breath and laughed. But it was already a complacent and cruel laugh. Okay. Song Yunzi stared at Li Yunxin and slowly retracted his hand. Hey. Then in a while we'll compete. Pa. He flicked his big sleeve and followed Li Daozhong to the back of the courtyard, laughing as he walked. Ha! Li Yunxin sighed slightly. Idiot. Chapter 126. The entire Mount June was shrouded in the night. But at this time, the magnificence of the School of the Emperor Star could be seen. It wasn't the magnificence of the building, but the ingenuity of the design. Along the steep mountain wall of Mount June, a wooden plank path was slanted upwards. There were handrails on the plank path and flowerbud-like lamps hung under the handrails. When someone walked over, the lamps would light up one by one. It was like a golden dragon coiled on the mountainside. But Ding Zhao and Sun were no longer enthusiastically explaining the intricacies to Li Yunxin. The three of them were mortals, but they were businessmen, so they weren't stupid. They could tell that this Li Xuanhuan wasn't an ordinary person. At this moment, although he was walking towards the middle hall, his heart was still anxious. They were afraid that this brother Li would do something strange when he arrived at the middle hall. At the end of the plank path, there was a flat ground cut out from the middle of the mountain. It was paved with white marble and had carved patterns. It was much more exquisite than the front hall. Even though the middle hall was also made of wood, it was ingenious. All kinds of wood were mixed together, creating a colorful and gorgeous feeling. Half of the middle hall was embedded in the mountain. Taoist Li didn't greet the guests behind him and went straight into the hall. There was a hall with 8 doors in the middle hall, but there were no tables. There were only rattan mats for people to sit on. He walked to the chair's seat and smiled. My friends, please take a seat. But today I have a good news to announce. Song Yunzi sat down with his head held high and looked up at Li Yunxin. He even smiled at him and seemed to be in a good mood. Li Yunxin didn't want to pay attention to him and sat across from him. When the other three were also seated, he asked, What good news? Taoist Li stroked his beard and smiled. I have a new concubine. He looked at Song Yunzi as he spoke. But she is a new bride, so it's not convenient for her to meet you. Let me send her greetings to all of you. He clapped his hands. So today's banquet needs to be more sumptuous. Everyone, you're in for a treat. He clapped again after saying this. 6 maids who looked fair and soft walked over with a smile. They walked up to the 6 of them, but their hands were empty. First, he knelt in front of him, then unbuttoned his shirt, and propped his arms on the floor. It became a white, soft and fragrant meat table. Now Li Yunxin knew where the strange sense of shame in the words of Ding Zhao and Sun in the tea house came from. In this era, it was not a shameful thing for a man to be lustful and play with women. But like this, no matter where it was, it could be called promiscuous. This Taoist priest Li really knows how to have fun. But he was an old hand that had seen many big scenes, so his expression did not change. He clapped his hands and praised, Taoist priest is indeed a wonderful person. Taoist priest Li didn't say anything. He clapped again. 6 more servants came to the meat table with plates in their hands, put the plates down and left. Ding Zhao and Sun all stared at the plates. It seemed that they had completely forgotten their worries and troubles, and only thought about the food on the plates. But the problem was, although they were not the kind of people who lived a luxurious life, they were not poor people either. Wei was the biggest city in the kingdom of Qing. There were all kinds of things to eat and play in the city. How could they show such an expression towards a plate of food? Li Yunxin looked at Song Yunzi again. He found that although he looked calm, there were more subtle signs that he was also looking forward to it. Something was wrong. The taste of food couldn't completely conquer a normal person, not to mention a cultivator. Maybe there were other ways. The magic of immortals. A magic of immortals that could make an emptiness realm cultivator fall for it. He sighed softly and looked at the wooden plate. In fact, there were only 10 pieces of meat inside. The appearance was not bad. The surface was slightly crispy and it was thinly sliced. There were some tendons in the slightly red meat. Once it entered the mouth, it would be crispy, tender, and fragrant. It would be a good taste. Daoist Li smiled and said, "Today's meat is vegetarian. The ingredients are fat, and oily. First, we will use maize dark shadow bamboo as a drawer and slowly steam it. Then we will slice it with a white jade knife and dry it in the shade of Mount June. Tonight, I will roast it again and serve it for everyone to enjoy. Please enjoy, esteemed guest." After saying this, Daoist Li used 2 fingers to pick up a piece and put it into his mouth. He chewed it carefully and then looked at Li Yunxin. The other 4 had already picked up the meat with a serious expression. They carefully and greedily tasted it. Only Li Yunxin stared at the meat for a while. He picked it up and put it in front of his nose to smell it. Then he put it down. Daoist Li stared at him and smiled. "My friend, don't you want to eat it? Which part doesn't suit your taste?" Song Yunzi raised his head and laughed mockingly. "This person, he is a crude and boring person. How could he recognize the beauty of this delicacy? This thing was originally..." Li Yunxin smiled at him. "Shut up, idiot." Song Yunzi's eyes widened again. He was stunned for a while and was about to explode. Li Yunxin turned to Daoist Li and smiled. "Daoist Li, although this meat is delicious, it's a pity to eat it now." Song Yunzi was about to continue mocking him, but Daoist Li made a sound of surprise. "Then please tell me, what is the pity?" Li Yunxin shook his head lightly. He slowly reached out and tapped the side of the plate. Then he slightly lowered his head as if thinking about what to say. But in reality, in these 3 breaths of time, his brain was operating at a speed he had never experienced in the past 15 years. Damn it. He originally wanted to catch a small grass snake to play with. But it seemed, he had 1 foot in the snake's nest. After Daoist Li commented on the meat on the wooden plate, Li Yunxin's mind was struck by a bolt of lightning. It was the same bolt of lightning. 3 months ago in that broken temple. Dragon's son put the severed limb of the swordsman into his mouth and said, "Those who are bold, fat ointment cannot eat like this. It needs to be slowly steamed, sliced and air-dried. When it's cloudy, it can be eaten as a side dish." From the moment he saw the boatman at the ferry, he knew that this Daoist Li wasn't human. He was practically carved from the same mold as the servant beside Red Madam that night. That strange man with a sharp nose, round black eyes and a dark green face, wasn't he a shrimp soldier? That broad, armored man, wasn't he a crab general? And the boatman at the ferry today was a giant green shrimp. Then he saw the smiles on the faces of the servants beside this Daoist Li, and the smile on this Daoist Li's face. He was definitely not human. And he knew that the meat in front of him, perhaps Song Yunzi and the others weren't familiar with it, but he was very familiar with it, was human meat. Both of them ate human meat and the way they ate it was almost the same. But Daoist Li was more particular. He followed Ding Zhao and Sun to see this Daoist Li because of the mysterious Lord Dongting. Li Yunxin had been thinking about why Dragon's son never mentioned Lord Dongting. Maybe he was his subordinate. Such a proud dragon son would be too lazy to talk about those things. But since the legend of Lord Dongting existed 3,000 years ago, and Mount June was named after him, then Lord Dongting must be a powerful demon and not Dragon Sun's subordinate. Was he an enemy or a friend or a foe or a friend? Li Yunxin knocked on the side of the wooden plate 3 times, then slowly raised his head and chuckled. Lu Ling could kill Dragon Sun and Bai Yunxin could also kill Dragon Sun. If Lord Dongting was a 3,000-year-old demon, would he have the power to kill Dragon Sun? If they were enemies, would they be able to coexist peacefully? Would they have a common understanding of how to eat human meat? If they were enemies, why didn't Lord Dongting quickly occupy the temple that used to worship Dragon Sun after Dragon Sun died? But as far as he knew, he didn't. These days, other than this Senhiku Dragon King Temple, All the other temples were empty. A great demon wouldn't be afraid of others fighting with him for incense. The reason why he didn't make a move must be because he had other intentions. For example, to lure the snake out of its hole. If a powerful demon killed Dragon Sun, he would definitely be curious about who occupied the empty Sanhika Dragon King temple, wondering if there were any survivors of Dragon Sun. Once he came, what would happen? He would be killed. Revenge. It seemed that Lord Dongting thought that one of the people who killed Dragon Sun was a demon. Then it was a friend. Lord Dongting was Dragon Sun's friend. At least he thought that he was Dragon Sun's friend. A friend that Dragon Sun didn't want to mention for some reason. Previously, Li Yunxin deliberately told the story of little Dragon Sun looking for his mother. Although he couldn't completely read Lord Dongting's mind because of his stiff expression, he knew that this story didn't make him feel disgusted. Instead, it made him think of another strange feeling, but it was a positive one. Lord Dongting wasn't Dragon Sun's enemy. Li Daoist didn't hate Dragon Sun. Li Daoist's way of eating human flesh was almost the same as Dragon Sun's. Maybe they even talked about this way. Li Daoist had such a palace in Dragon Sun's territory, and his extravagance was even bigger than Dragon Sun's. Dragon Sun actually allowed him to exist. Li Daoist's servants were surprisingly similar to Red Lady's servants. Red Lady was Lord Dongting's daughter. Li Daoist was Lord Dongting. Li Yunxin raised his head and smiled. Because a good friend of mine once said that meat cooked in this way should be eaten with wine on a cloudy day. And now it's a moonlit night and there's no wine. And I thought of that friend and seeing this delicacy now. I can't eat it anymore. After saying this, Li Daoist was silent for a while. He still had a smile on his face, but if he was a human he would probably have a different expression at this moment. He stared at Li Yunxin, and even Song Yunzi and the three mortals noticed the abnormality. But before he could say anything, Li Yunxin had already stood up, strode to the center of the hall and faced Li Daoist. The expression on his face became solemn without a hint of playfulness. He bowed deeply to Li Daoist and said sorrowfully, "Lord Dongting, please avenge my friend." Chapter 127. Hearing this, the three mortals were still calm. They just stared with their eyes wide open and their mouths wide open. They even forgot to eat the meat. Of course they knew Lord Dongting. When Li Yunxin was on the boat, he led them to discuss this issue. Now he had a clear impression of it. Therefore he could only stare at Li Yunxin in a daze. He finally knew what was wrong with this person. He was a lunatic. When they first came, they thought he was a romantic scholar because he talked so eloquently and acted so irrationally. But now, he was just a lunatic. However, Song Yunzi frowned after a moment of surprise. Although compared to many dragons among men he seemed stupid and arrogant as a cultivator in terms of intelligence, there were indeed very few real fools. He had known this Taoistly for a long time. He knew he was a mysterious cultivator. He didn't know which cave or school he belonged to, but he was really good at Taoism. But now he heard Li Yunxin talk about Lord Dongting. He was not a mortal, so he had a different understanding of supernatural powers and people. Therefore he seriously considered the name Lord Dongting. Unfortunately, he had only been in the city of Wei for more than 20 years. He didn't usually chat with mortals, so he didn't know what kind of god Lord Dongting was. After Li Yunxin exposed Taoist priest Li's identity, he finally stopped laughing. He rubbed his face and his expression became solemn. He stared at Li Yunxin with his eyes wide open and thin lips puckered. He put his hands on the table and stared at Li Yunxin. After a while he said slowly, "When you came I knew you were not an ordinary person. But I couldn't see through your real identity. But now, you mentioned your friend. Tell me, who is your friend? What's your grudge against him?" Li Yunxin stood up slowly. He had gotten what he wanted from Lord Dongting's tone and actions. But he needed to confirm it. Or in other words, his top priority now was to stay away from this Taoist Li. After all, this was only his deduction. No matter how logical the deduction was, there was always the possibility of extreme abnormalities. His reaction and performance just now were not the best choice, but it was the best choice he could think of at the moment. He straightened his body, tightened his brows, pressed down the corners of his mouth and squinted his eyes, looking sad and angry. "My name is not Li Xuanhuan," he said. "My real name is Li Yunxin." "He's an artist," After saying these 2 sentences, he glanced at Zhou Yunzi and silently counted in his heart. 1, 2, 3. Indeed, Zhou Yunzi awoke from his momentary shock and shouted, "What nonsense are you talking about? Li Yunxin was dead." "You clearly..." Li Yunxin immediately interrupted him with grief and indignation. He frowned and clenched his fists. His body trembled slightly. "I'm dead. I died in the scheme of you and that Lu Ling. Of course you know I'm dead." He stepped forward and asked Zhou Yunzi, "Didn't you and that Ling Kongzi plot to kill my friend, and then fight with a big demon?" Zhou Yunzi was stunned again. He couldn't believe that Li Yunxin could talk nonsense in front of him without even blinking his eyes. But in Taoist Li's eyes, it seemed to mean something else. Without waiting for Zhou Yunzi to explain, Taoist Li turned to him and asked, "Is this true?" Li Yunxin shouted, "Lord Dongting is asking you if this is true." Lord Dongting's words. When he said Lord Dongting before, Zhou Yunzi was already confused about the identity of this Lord Dongting. After being friends for so long, he didn't know that Taoist Li had such a secret identity. So, was it good or bad to be friends with him? Why are they talking about this now? His heart was filled with panic and anxiety and his mind was in a mess. After Li Yunxin said Lord Dongting 2 more times, Zhou Yunzi finally lost his mind. He just wanted to figure it out first. "You are Lord Dongting." He didn't answer Taoist Li's question but asked this question out of instinct. Li Yunxin shouted with grief and indignation, "You didn't expect this, did you? This is justice, he is Lord Dongting. What else do you have to say?" Zhou Yunzi was even more anxious. He said repeatedly, I am not. I will kill you, you bastard." He only knew that Li Yunxin was pressing him, not giving him time to breathe or think, so he couldn't tell the truth. Blood rushed to his head and he waved his hand to attack Li Yunxin. "Only by killing this bastard can we talk." How could Li Yunxin be afraid of him? He was now in the body of a big demon and he was extremely powerful. Although he was only in the transcendent state and his power was not enough, he was not someone that an emptiness state cultivator could kill. He stood there with his head held high and he didn't move an inch. He said passionately, "If Lord Dongting wants to protect your friend today, I will stand here and die in front of you." Zhou Yunzi was even more annoyed. His arm tore through the air and a golden light appeared. It hit Li Yunxin's forehead. However, Taoist Li, who had been silent for a long time, shouted, "How dare you!" With a shout, an unstoppable and tyrannical demonic energy instantly swept across the entire lobby. In the blink of an eye, this demonic power broke the camouflage on Li Yunxin's body, and his original appearance was revealed. Zhou Yunzi's hand that hit Li Yunxin's forehead was forced back, and he even took a few steps back, and his whole body hit the wooden pillar behind him. Looking at this Taoist Li, what a majestic appearance. He was no longer the Taoist Li in the plain robe, but a red-armored god surrounded by green light. This Lord Dongting had a red face and his face seemed to be smeared with grease. He had a pair of big black eyes and the distance between his eyes was very wide. In the middle of his eyes was a wide nose, but his nostrils were small. His wide mouth was tightly closed and 2 strands of red beard hung down from his lips. He wore a red robe and the robe was decorated with scale armor. On his body, there was a silk cloak that looked like it was made of silk and it fluttered in the air. This 9-foot-tall Lord Dongting looked like a god. Lord Dongting revealed his Dharmakaya, and his expression suddenly became much more lively. He frowned, waved his hand and shouted with a loud voice, "Is this person telling the truth?" From the moment Yunzi was thrown into a daze and then he saw the real bodies of this Taoist Li and Li Xuanhuan, he knew that these two were not humans. In shock and anger, he heard Li Yunxin shout at him after Lord Dongting, "Thief! Look at me. Am I Li Yunxin?" This cultivator wanted to spit out a mouthful of blood, thinking that these two demons had joined hands to plot against him. He pointed at Li Yunxin. You Li Yunxin, you." Li Yunxin didn't look at him anymore. With a sad smile, he turned to Lord Dongting and said, "My lord, please restrain this evil cultivator and listen to me. After I finish, my lord, you may want me to confront him." At this time the 3 mortals were so scared that they almost fainted. They could only lie on the ground and shiver. Lord Dongting waved his hand again, and Song Yunzi was immediately wrapped in a watery light. An emptiness realm cultivator couldn't hear, see, or speak and could only stand still. This 3,000-year-old great demon looked at Li Yunxin and said, "My friend, don't panic. Tell me in detail." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Note 1. Silk cloak. You can see it in the paintings of flying apsaras or in the paintings of immortals. It's the thing wrapped around the arm. There are also non-mainstream people who use snakes as silk cloaks. Chapter 128. Li Yunxin also looked at Lord Dongting, took a deep breath and said loudly, "That friend of mine is the Wei River Dragon King who showed his divinity in the city of Wei a few days ago. He called himself the 9th Young Master. He was the one who told me the way to eat meat. That day I was practicing." Li Yunxin talked about the deep friendship between him and the 9th Young Master. When he talked about the emotional part, he choked a few times and couldn't control himself. "I was killed by that Lu Ling, so I don't know much about other things. But later I learned that Lu Ling had a fight with a big demon. I think that the big demon probably has something powerful in her hands, so the two of them had an internal conflict." This majestic Lord Dongting listened to him quietly, and his expression changed. "That feather robe." He sighed slightly. It was because of that feather robe. Li Yunxin was slightly stunned, but he didn't say anything. When he died that day, Lu Ling destroyed his soul. When the two of them fought out of the city, he started to reconstruct his soul. So he only knew that his plan had succeeded. But there were some things he didn't know. For example, Lord Dongting's words. But now, it seemed that it was a lucky hit. Li Yunxin frowned. What feather robe? This majestic Lord Dongting didn't know what was on his mind. He hesitated for a while and then said, "That big demon is not a big demon in this mortal world. Her adoptive father is the golden-winged roc, the master of all feathers in the world. This Bai Yunxin feeds on scale worms and her favorite is Dragon Sun." He sighed again. "Although I don't know where the golden-winged roc king lives, I know it's not in this mortal world. That Bai Yunxin needs that feather robe to go in and out of her own home. But 1,000 years ago her feather robe was snatched away by a Taoist priest surnamed Niu from Daotong, so she couldn't go back. For the past 1,000 years she's been trying to find her treasure. Well, say, a robe of feathers." Li Yunxin kept this in mind. He realized that this could be one of the key factors in deciding the outcome of the battle. Lord Dongting suddenly rolled his eyes and sat down slowly. "Since you're already dead, how did you manage to cultivate the Xian spirit body?" he asked slowly. "What you've said makes sense. But, how did you know to find me?" This was the most crucial and fatal problem. Li Yunxin had almost no information about Lord Dongting. He only had one way, to let the great demon answer him himself. "The 9th Young Master rarely mentions Junshang." As he said this, he quickly glanced at Lord Dongting's expression and immediately added, "In fact, I hardly said it. In this world, I'm probably the only friend who's ever heard news about Junshang from him. He regarded me as his confidant and said that he often felt lonely. We're like-minded. Although he's moody sometimes, I know his true nature." Speaking of this, Lord Dongting was still sitting upright. Li Yunxin said, "Even so, he probably only told me. He's an arrogant person. He hides his feelings in his heart and is afraid that others will laugh at him if he tells them. However, there was only one time. He drank too much and said that in this Wei River, there's only one person that he wants to be close to but can't." As soon as he said this, Lord Dongting's expression changed. Thus, Li Yunxin knew that he had caught the point. "You said you were close friends with him. Do you have any proof?" Lord Dongting's two whiskers trembled slightly. "Proof?" His reaction made Li Yunxin slightly surprised. He was very confident in his own ability. He didn't think it was a great thing to observe the other person's expression and tone, then quickly adjust his response and get the information he wanted in the end. But he is still a little surprised by Lord Dongting's obvious emotional outpouring. When he found out that Li Daozhang was Lord Dongting, he felt that he was in a terrible crisis. A 3,000-year-old great demon. The 9th Young Master even tacitly allowed him to exist for such a long time and have such a palace in Mount June. In his impression, this Lord Dongting should be a terrible existence with infinite supernatural power, profound shrewdness, and even a trace of his smile has ulterior motives. However, after the verbal attack he realized, Lord Dongting wasn't the level he imagined. He wasn't stupid. In fact, he was more vigilant and smarter than many people. As a demon, he could even be called moderate and peaceful, almost human. But he didn't look like an old demon who had lived for 3,000 years and had seen many things. Li Yunxin keeps this in mind and realizes that her previous reaction was a bit extreme. If she had known that Lord Dongting was like this, she wouldn't have been so angry. But there was no perfect plan in the world. Everything could be adjusted. Now he understood. Maybe Lord Dongting and the ninth young master had some inside story or misunderstanding. The ninth young master didn't want to mention him, but Lord Dongting was excited because of that one sentence. So he breathed a sigh of relief, put his hand into his clothes, and took out the reverse scale. This thing was actually the key to lead him to the position of Qi Wen. Now that he had returned to the position, this reverse scale was just a souvenir. Li Yunxin didn't think about why he brought it with him, but it really came in handy at this moment. He put the reverse scale on the table in front of Lord Dongting, saying, but when the words came to his mouth, he hesitated for a while. Maybe it was because he knew Lord Dongting wasn't as terrible as he had imagined, at least in terms of character and shrewdness. He suddenly felt a little dispirited. He suddenly didn't want to talk. Maybe it was because of this reason. But it wasn't because of anything else. But he had to say it, he had to pull himself together, continue to breathe and use some hints to cheer himself up again, to forget the little episode just now, and sadly said, he gave me this reverse scale. Make me a close-fitting armor. After I died, I entered the samsara, but I don't know why my soul was attached to this reverse scale. After he died, he still protected me. Because of this, I thought. I came to Dongting Lake to look for him. I met these 3 people by chance and heard them talking about Lord Dongting, so I asked Taoist Li if the palace he built on Mount Jun had anything to do with Lord Dongting. Maybe it was the blessing of the ninth young master in heaven. I really met Lord Dongting. Hearing his words, Lord Dongting was silent for a while. Then he just stared at the reverse scale on the table without touching it. After a long time he said, did he really say he wanted to be close to him but he couldn't? Yes. Lord Dongting was silent for a while and the green light around him gradually dimmed. Then he waved his hand, you can take this reverse scale back. You can also take this Taoist priest away. He sighed again. As he sighed, dense water vapor rose from his mouth and nose. This reminded Li Yunxin of an incense burner or the ninth young master who stared at him that night before he died. I have known him for some years. Now that I summoned him here, I want to ask him about this. Since you have made it clear, you can deal with him. Lord Dongting sighed again. This time his whole body was shrouded in water vapor, and his face was almost invisible. Li Yunxin didn't know if it was a demon crying. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.